On my 68th birthday, my son and his wife threw me a surprise party. It felt like a rare moment of family warmth until they pushed a document across the table and demanded my signature. I refused. 3 weeks later, I came home to find the locks changed and all my belongings in cheap cardboard boxes on the porch. But what they did not know was that I had spent 40 years preparing for a moment exactly like this. My name is Xavier Hayes. I am 68 years old and a retired mechanic living in Brooklyn. Before I tell you how I dismantled my daughters-in-law family empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed always digs its own grave. The air in my dining room still smelled of vanilla frosting and the expensive champagne Megan insisted on bringing. We had just cut the cake. I was sitting at the head of the table. It was the same oak table my late wife Evelyn and I bought secondhand 30 years ago. My son Kendrick was standing near the window, nervously loosening his silk tie. He is a vice president at an investment bank now. He wears custom suits that cost more than my first car. He avoids looking at me lately as if my calloused hands and gray hair remind him of a past he is desperate to erase. Megan, his wife, sat right next to me. She comes from a wealthy white real estate family. She wore a pristine designer dress and a smile that never quite reached her cold eyes. Without a word of transition, she reached into her leather bag and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. She slid them across the table right over the cake crumbs. "Happy birthday, Xavier," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We want to help you out this year. Property taxes in Brooklyn are getting really complicated, so we had our accountants draft up a tax update form. Just sign at the bottom and Kendrick and I will handle all the city paperwork for you. You will not have to worry about a single thing." I looked down at the document. The ink was fresh, the legal jargon was dense and clearly designed to confuse. But I am not an uneducated man. You do not survive decades as a black man in the city by signing papers blindly. I adjusted my reading glasses and flipped past the first page, ignoring Megan's loud, impatient sigh. I traced my finger down the paragraphs until I found a clause buried deep on page 3. It was deliberately printed in a smaller font. My blood ran completely cold. It was not a tax update. It was a full power of attorney document. It included clauses transferring the deed of my house into a trust controlled entirely by Megan and Kendrick. This house, the very roof over my head. I closed my eyes for a second, and the memories flooded back. I remembered the year Evelyn and I bought this place. Brooklyn was not a playground for the rich and famous back then. It was rough, gritty, and completely ignored by people like Megan's family. I worked 18 hours a day at the auto shop. I came home every night with motor oil permanently stained into my knuckles and my back aching so badly I could barely stand straight. Evelyn worked exhausting night shifts as a nurse at the hospital. We scraped together every single penny. I laid this hardwood floor with my own hands, pulling up rotten boards, while Kendrick was just a toddler sleeping in a playpen nearby. We built this home out of sweat, blood, and sacrifice. Now my son, wearing his Italian suit, was standing in the corner. He was letting his entitled wife try to steal it from under me with a piece of paper and a fake smile. They looked at me expecting the tired old black man to just nod and sign away his life. They thought I was a fool. I slowly took off my glasses and set them on the table. The silence in the room stretched out thick and suffocating. I pushed the papers back across the table toward Megan. "I am not signing this," I said. My voice was low, steady, and absolute. Megan's artificial smile vanished instantly. Her face tightened, and a flush of angry red crept up her neck. "What do you mean you are not signing it?" She snapped, her tone completely changing. "Xavier, we went through a lot of trouble to set this up. It is for your own protection. The neighborhood is changing. Property values are too high for you to manage alone." I looked past her and stared directly at my son. "Kendrick," I said, "look at me." He flinched. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor outside the window, anywhere but his father's face. "Kendrick," I said again, louder this time, "tell your wife that this house belongs to me and your mother. Tell her I will manage my own taxes." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just swallowed hard and looked away again. The cowardice in his posture broke something deep inside my chest. The boy I had sacrificed everything for was standing there complicit in his own father's ruin. He was too weak to look me in the eye while he tried to rob me. Megan slammed her hands on the table, making the cake plates rattle. "You are being completely irrational." She raised her voice, treating me like a disobedient child. "You are 68 years old, Xavier. You live alone in a house worth $1.5 million. You cannot even maintain the yard properly anymore. We are trying to protect the family asset before you do something stupid and lose it." "This is not a family asset, Megan," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "This is my home, and I suggest you take your fraudulent paperwork and get out of my house." Megan gasped, her eyes widening in pure fury. No one spoke to her like that. She grabbed her champagne glass and hurled it onto the hardwood floor. The crystal shattered into 100 pieces, sending sharp shards flying across the wood I had laid by hand. Without another word, she grabbed her bag and stormed out the front door. Kendrick scurried after her like an obedient servant, leaving me alone in the quiet house. I stood up and carefully swept the broken glass into a dustpan. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. I was trembling with a cold, calculating rage. The mask had fallen. I knew exactly what they were trying to do. I locked the front door and walked into my study, picking up the phone. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It was Jonathan Reed, my private attorney, and one of the most ruthless legal minds in Manhattan. Jonathan answered on the second ring. "Xavier," he said, "how was the birthday dinner?" "They tried to get me to sign a power of attorney," I told him, my voice tight. "They hid it under the guise of tax documents. I refused and threw them out." "But Jonathan, I need to know what their next move is. Can they force a sale without my signature?" There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. It was the kind of silence that tells you the ground beneath your feet is already collapsing. Xavier, Jonathan finally said, his tone dead serious. "Go to your safe right now. You need to check if your original documents are still there. Because if they failed to get your signature tonight, they do not actually need it. I got a tip from a contact at the county clerk office this morning. They are not trying to sell the house legally. They got hold of Kendrick's original birth certificate and your late wife's death certificate. They are setting up a medical proxy to declare you mentally unfit. Run." I spent the next 3 weeks operating completely under the radar, just as Jonathan advised. I stayed in a modest motel in Queens, meeting daily with him in his secure office in Manhattan. We prepared every countermeasure imaginable, setting up financial firewalls and securing the true documentation of my hidden assets. I felt ready. I thought I had anticipated their worst possible move. I drove my old Ford truck back to my Brooklyn neighborhood, feeling a grim sense of readiness. The sky was dark with heavy gray clouds threatening a massive downpour. I parked on the street and walked up to the front door of the house I had owned and maintained for over 3 decades. I pulled my silver key from my pocket and slid it into the familiar brass deadbolt. It did not turn. I jiggled the handle and tried again, pushing my weight against the heavy oak door. The key was blocked halfway. I looked closely at the metal casing. It was shiny, completely scratch-free, and brand new. The locks had been professionally changed. A cold knot formed in my stomach. They had not waited for a lengthy legal battle in court. They had simply taken over my territory while I was away preparing my defenses. They bypassed every moral and legal boundary, moving with the speed of greedy vultures. Just as the realization hit me, the skies finally opened up. Cold rain began to pour, soaking my heavy coat and the wooden porch planks I had varnished by hand last summer. It was then that I looked down and saw them. Stacked haphazardly near the side of the porch, barely covered by the small awning, were 5 cheap cardboard boxes. The tops were unsealed, and the cardboard was already darkening and sagging heavily from the rain. I stepped closer and looked inside. My heart cracked straight down the middle. There, laying in the dampness, were Evelyn's favorite floral dresses, the ones she wore to church on Sunday mornings. Her framed photographs from our wedding day were tossed carelessly on top of old kitchen utensils. The delicate porcelain teacups I had bought her for our 20th anniversary were thrown into a box with heavy hardcover books. They were completely shattered into jagged white pieces. They did not just pack my things to clear the space. They desecrated the memory of the woman who scrubbed hospital floors to give Kendrick a decent life. I stood in the freezing rain, staring at the broken porcelain, and felt a rage so pure it burned the air in my lungs. I looked up at the house. On the second floor, in what used to be Kendrick's childhood bedroom, I saw a shadow move. The heavy beige curtain twitched. Through the glass, I caught a clear glimpse of my son. He was wearing another tailored suit, casually holding a cup of steaming coffee. He looked down at me, standing in the freezing rain with his mother's ruined belongings. He did not come downstairs. He did not open the window to explain himself. He simply pulled the curtain shut, hiding securely in the darkness of the house I bought. He erased me from his sight just as easily as he had erased my name from the front door locks. I slammed my clenched fist against the heavy oak door. I banged on it until my knuckles bruised, shouting for my son to come down and face me like a man. The door swung open, but it was not Kendrick standing on the other side. A massive security guard, easily 6.5 feet tall with a thick, muscular neck and a dark tactical uniform, blocked the entrance. The shiny logo pinned on his chest belonged to the private security firm hired exclusively by Megan's father's real estate empire. "You need to step back right now, old man," the guard barked, his voice devoid of any basic human respect. "This is private residential property. This is my property." I shot back, planting my boots firmly on the porch boards. "I bought this house 30 years ago with my own money. Tell the cowards hiding upstairs to come out here and face me right now." The guard sneered and stepped forward, closing the distance between us with intimidating speed. He placed 2 massive hands on my shoulders and shoved me violently. I stumbled backward, my work boots slipping dangerously on the wet wooden planks. I lost my balance entirely and fell hard against the porch steps. A sharp, agonizing pain shot up my spine, but I refused to cry out. I forced myself to sit up, glaring fiercely at the man who had just assaulted me on my own property. The guard reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a folded piece of thick legal paper. He tossed it down at me with absolute disdain. It landed on the wet concrete right next to my boots. "You are trespassing," the guard said, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "That is an official eviction notice and a property transfer mandate. The house belongs to the Albright Real Estate Trust now. You have been deemed medically and mentally unfit to manage your own estate by a licensed physician. If you do not leave this property in the next 60 seconds, I am calling the police to arrest a vagrant." The heavy oak door slammed shut, echoing with a finality that shook the very foundation of the porch. I sat in the pouring rain, staring at the piece of paper. They had actually done it. They used their wealth to bypass the law, forging a medical proxy to steal my home. I slowly picked myself up from the wet concrete. My back ached terribly from the brutal fall, but I forced myself to stand tall. I carefully picked up the soaked eviction notice and slipped it into my inner coat pocket. This was exactly the kind of arrogant overreach Jonathan and I had been waiting for. I turned around to gather Evelyn's ruined boxes, hoping to salvage whatever fragile memories I could from the pouring rain. As I bent down to pick up her framed photograph, my cell phone vibrated violently against my chest. I pulled it out, wiping the heavy raindrops from the glowing screen. It was an automated high-priority security alert from my primary banking institution. The message was brief, but it carried the destructive force of a nuclear bomb. Alert. Unauthorized withdrawal detected. Account balance for Xavier Hayes' retirement fund has been reduced to zero. $200,000 successfully transferred to Albright Proxy Management Trust. I stared at the glowing digital letters in absolute disbelief. They had not just stolen the physical roof over my head, they had used their forged medical proxy to illegally drain my entire life savings in a matter of mere minutes. Megan and Kendrick thought they had completely broken me. They thought they had left a helpless, senile black man with absolutely nothing but wet cardboard boxes on a porch. I looked up at the closed curtain, and a cold, calculating smile formed on my face. They had no idea who they just robbed. The cold seeped through the thin metal doors of my old Ford truck. I had parked 2 blocks away from my own house, forced to spend the night huddled in the driver's seat. My back throbbed relentlessly from the fall on the porch. The rain hammered against the windshield, a rhythmic reminder of my son's betrayal. I pulled my worn wool coat tighter around my chest and watched the streetlights flicker in the storm. I did not close my eyes. I was not a victim seeking pity in the dark. I was a strategist calculating my exact next steps. Just past midnight, a sharp rap on the driver's side window shattered the quiet. A blinding flashlight beam cut through the darkness, hitting me straight in the eyes. I squinted and rolled down the manual window. 2 patrol officers stood outside, their raincoats dripping. "License and registration," a young officer barked, resting his hand heavily on his duty belt. We got a call from the homeowner at the Albright property down the street. She reported a suspicious vagrant lurking in a rusted vehicle. Megan had actually called the police on me. She watched me suffer in the freezing rain and then decided to humiliate me further by having me treated like a criminal in the very neighborhood I helped build. I reached into my glove compartment, moving slowly so they would not misinterpret my actions. I handed over my identification without saying a word. The officer inspected it, shining his light from the plastic card to my face. "Look, Mr. Hayes," he said, his tone slightly softening but still carrying that authoritative edge. "I do not care if you used to live around here. The property owner wants you gone. Move this vehicle immediately or I will have it impounded and arrest you for loitering." I did not argue. Arguing with a police officer on a dark street is a foolish game, and I play only to win. I nodded, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. I watched my house fade into the rearview mirror. Megan and Kendrick thought they had successfully discarded me. They believed the zero balance in my standard retirement account meant I was completely broken. They were entirely wrong. I drove straight out of Brooklyn, leaving the quiet residential streets behind. I crossed the bridge into Manhattan. The glowing skyscrapers pierced the dark, stormy sky like giant monuments to wealth and power. I navigated the empty early morning streets until I reached a towering black glass building on Wall Street. It was the headquarters of Obsidian Wealth Management. This was an exclusive private banking firm that did not cater to ordinary millionaires. They managed generational wealth, corporate buyouts, and shadow funds. I parked my rusted Ford right in front of the pristine glass doors, ignoring the valet parking sign. I walked into the grand marble lobby, my wet work boots leaving muddy footprints across the polished floor. The overnight security guard immediately stood up, ready to throw out the disheveled old black man. But before he could even open his mouth, the heavy mahogany doors to the executive suite swung open. Mr. Sterling, the senior branch manager, practically sprinted across the lobby. He was fully dressed in a bespoke suit despite the early hour. He shoved the security guard aside and bowed his head with profound respect. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "It is an absolute honor to have you here in person, sir. We received your secure proxy alert an hour ago. Your private suite is prepared and the entire executive team is on standby." I walked past the bewildered security guard without a single glance. I followed Sterling into the private elevator. Megan thought her family had power because they managed some residential real estate. She was about to learn what true financial dominance actually looked like. Sterling led me into a massive penthouse office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The room was soundproofed and equipped with advanced financial terminals. I sat down in the leather executive chair. The contrast between my damp, worn clothes and the extreme luxury of the room was striking, but I felt completely in my element. "Bring up the Vanguard Trust master accounts," I ordered, keeping my voice completely flat. "I want the immediate activation of my Tier 1 anonymous portfolio. Remove all dormant protocols." Sterling typed rapidly on his encrypted tablet. Within seconds, the massive wall monitors flared to life. Columns of numbers and intricate financial webs filled the screens. The total asset valuation at the bottom right corner displayed a figure that would make Megan's arrogant father choke on his expensive cigars. Over $400 million in liquid assets, shadow property holdings, and corporate debt acquisitions. I had spent 40 years quietly buying up tax liens, distressed commercial properties, and bad corporate debt across the eastern seaboard. I lived a modest life because I never needed to show off my wealth. True power is invisible until the exact moment you decide to strike. I pointed a calloused finger at the center screen. "Now I want a complete forensic audit of Kendrick Hayes," I commanded. "I want every single transaction, every hidden offshore account, every credit line, and every shadow transfer connected to his social security number. Do not leave a single stone unturned." The financial analysts in the room worked with frantic efficiency. Keyboards clattered like gunfire. I watched the screens intently as my son's entire financial existence was laid bare before my eyes. Kendrick projected the image of a highly successful investment banker. He drove a customized imported sports car and bought his wife diamond necklaces for no reason. But the data painted a drastically different and desperate picture. His legitimate bank accounts were severely overdrawn. His credit scores were in a free fall. He had completely maxed out multiple high-interest loans using predatory shadow lenders. He was moving small amounts of money constantly just to cover the minimum monthly interest payments. He was not a successful executive. He was a drowning man gasping for air. But what caught my attention was a series of massive, erratic wire transfers. They were routed through dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands before disappearing into cryptocurrency exchanges. "Track the final destination of those offshore wire transfers," I instructed, leaning closer to the monitors. "I need to know exactly who my son is bleeding money to." The lead analyst isolated the crypto transactions and ran a reverse trace on the digital wallets. The results popped up on the main screen in glaring red text. The final recipient was a shell company owned entirely by the Volkov Syndicate. They were a ruthless Eastern European organized crime ring operating out of Brighton Beach. They controlled underground high-stakes gambling dens and illegal sports betting rings. Kendrick was not just living beyond his means. He was a degenerate gambling addict. The monitor displayed his total outstanding debt to the syndicate. It was exactly $2 million. The deadline for the final balloon payment was marked for the end of this very month. My heart turned to pure ice. Everything suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. Kendrick did not steal my house just to please his greedy wife. He stole my house to save his own life. The Volkov Syndicate did not send collection letters. They broke legs and buried bodies under concrete foundations. My son was backed into a deadly corner by ruthless criminals. He needed $2 million in clean, untraceable cash immediately. So he decided to sacrifice his own father. He forged a medical proxy, declared me mentally unfit, and handed my $1.5 million home to his father-in-law's real estate company for a quick cash liquidation. He sold my legacy to save his own skin. He thought my house was the perfect scapegoat. I stared at the red numbers on the screen. The betrayal was absolute, but my clarity was absolute as well. They wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life. Now it was my turn to roll the dice. I left the Obsidian Wealth Management building as the pale morning sun began to bleed through the dense Manhattan skyline. I climbed back into my rusted Ford truck, my mind buzzing with the lethal financial data I had just uncovered at the bank. I needed to meet with my lawyer, Jonathan, to prepare the first immediate strike against my son and his wife. I drove back across the bridge toward Brooklyn, keeping strictly to the speed limit. I was completely focused on the road ahead, calculating every legal maneuver. But as I turned the corner onto a quiet residential street, near my old neighborhood, a massive white ambulance suddenly pulled out from a narrow alleyway. It slammed its brakes hard, blocking the entire road directly in front of my front bumper. The glaring red and blue emergency lights flashed violently, cutting through the thick morning fog. I stopped my truck, instinctively raising my hands to the steering wheel. The rear doors of the ambulance swung open aggressively. Two burly paramedics wearing dark tactical uniforms stepped out onto the damp pavement. They were flanked closely by a uniformed police officer holding a radio. They marched straight toward my driver's side window. The officer tapped heavily on the glass with his thick metal flashlight. "Step out of the vehicle right now, Mr. Hayes," the officer commanded, his voice sharp and carrying no room for debate. "You are coming with us immediately." I looked closely at the paramedics. They held thick leather restraints tightly in their hands. "We have a court-mandated medical extraction order," one of the paramedics announced, unfolding a sealed legal document bearing a judge's signature. "You have been legally declared a critical danger to yourself and others. Do not resist us, or we will be forced to sedate you right here on the street." I did not fight them. Resisting a police officer and two hostile paramedics on a Brooklyn street is a guaranteed death sentence for an older black man. I unbuckled my seatbelt slowly and stepped out into the cold morning air, keeping my hands visible. The paramedics grabbed my arms with excessive, forceful grips, shoving me into the back of the brightly lit ambulance. They slammed the heavy rear doors shut, plunging me into a claustrophobic white medical box. The police officer sat directly across from me, holding the court order. I demanded to see the paperwork immediately. He hesitated for a second, but handed me the clipboard. I adjusted my reading glasses and scanned the legal filing. My blood boiled like hot lead beneath my calm exterior. Megan had filed an emergency psychiatric hold against me late the previous afternoon. The paperwork was a masterful fabrication of racial profiling and vicious calculating lies. She wrote a detailed sworn statement claiming I suffered from rapid-onset aggressive Alzheimer's disease. She described me as highly unstable, prone to sudden violent outbursts, and deeply disoriented. The specific language she used was deliberate and extremely manipulative. She painted a terrifying picture of a large, delusional black man wandering the public streets, threatening his own family members, and living in absolute filth inside a rusted truck. She explicitly claimed I was hoarding dangerous weapons and destroying private property. She weaponized every ugly stereotype she could find to convince a white judge that I needed to be locked away strictly for public safety. She even attached glossy photos of the broken porcelain teacups on my porch, blaming the destruction on my supposed violent mental breakdown. The judge signed the emergency mandate without requiring a single prior medical evaluation. Megan simply used her wealthy father's high-level legal connections to fast-track a psychiatric imprisonment. She wanted me completely stripped of my basic human rights, trapped in a heavily padded cell where my voice would literally mean absolutely nothing. They were not just stealing my money anymore. They were actively trying to erase my entire existence. The ambulance lurched forward, its sirens wailing loudly as it sped relentlessly through the busy city traffic. The two paramedics sat on either side of me, their muscles tense, anticipating a massive physical fight. They fully expected the violent, confused old man described in Megan's fraudulent legal filing. They expected me to scream loudly, thrash against the metal walls, and demand aggressively to be released. I gave them absolutely nothing. I sat perfectly still, my posture straight and my breathing completely regulated. I rested my hands calmly on my knees, staring blankly at the metal wall opposite me. My total silence clearly unnerved them. The older paramedic kept exchanging confused, nervous glances with the police officer. This was not the typical behavior of an aggressive dementia patient. This was the practiced discipline of a man who had spent decades surviving a hostile corporate and social world by controlling his every single emotion. I knew exactly where they were taking me. They were not taking me to a standard city hospital or a public ward. Megan would never risk a legitimate state-employed doctor examining my perfectly healthy brain. They were driving me to a highly private facility, a high-end psychiatric clinic catering specifically to wealthy families who needed to quietly disappear inconvenient relatives. While the paramedics briefly looked away, I slowly slid my right hand into the deep pocket of my heavy wool coat. My fingers wrapped securely around the small digital voice recorder Jonathan had given me just weeks ago. It was a high-grade covert device used by corporate investigators capable of picking up a faint whisper from across a noisy, crowded room. I pressed my thumb firmly against the tactical record button, feeling the slight click of activation. A tiny red light blinked once against the dark fabric, confirming the device was rolling and recording. I left my hand inside the pocket, making sure the sensitive microphone was perfectly positioned to capture every single word spoken in my presence. I was not a helpless victim being dragged unwillingly to a slaughterhouse. I was a fully armed predator walking directly into their carefully laid trap. I needed them to feel completely in control of the situation. I needed them to expose their entire criminal conspiracy clearly on tape. The ambulance finally slowed down and turned sharply into a private gated driveway. I heard the heavy iron gate shut forcefully behind us, sealing me inside their facility. The paramedics escorted me down a long, sterile hallway that smelled strongly of industrial bleach and expensive artificial air freshener. They pushed me roughly into a small, windowless examination room and locked the heavy security door from the outside. I sat on the rigid medical chair, waiting in the absolute silence. 10 minutes later, the door clicked open. A tall man wearing a pristine white lab coat walked in confidently. He had slicked back hair, an expensive gold watch on his wrist, and the arrogant smirk of a man who loved playing God with people's lives. He was Dr. Eris Thorne, the executive director of the private clinic. He did not carry a standard stethoscope or a basic medical chart. He carried a sleek, leather-bound legal folder. He sat directly across from me, crossing his legs, comfortably. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his tone entirely transactional and completely devoid of any medical empathy. "Let us skip the boring medical evaluations entirely. Your daughter-in-law has paid very well for my highly specialized services. You are currently under a strict involuntary psychiatric hold. I can legally keep you heavily sedated in a locked ward for the rest of your natural life based purely on my sole medical authority." He leaned forward deliberately and opened the leather folder, sliding a crisp legal document across the cold metal table. "But there is a very simple and painless way out of this facility," he continued, tapping a gold pen rhythmically against the paper. "Sign this property transfer finalizing the immediate sale of your Brooklyn home to the Albright Trust. Give them the house today, and I will personally sign your official release papers declaring your miraculous recovery right now." I looked at the gold pen resting on the cold metal table. I looked up at Dr. Eris Thorne. His arrogant smile was perfectly practiced. He was a man accustomed to breaking people who had absolutely no power left. He waited for me to reach for the pen. I kept my hands folded, resting on my knees. The silence stretched. Thorne sighed, heavily annoyed that his simple transaction was hitting a speed bump. He stood up and walked over to a stainless steel medical cabinet. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick glass syringe filled with a cloudy, viscous liquid. He tapped the glass with his manicured fingernail, pushing a tiny drop of fluid out of the needle. "This is a high-dose chemical sedative, Mr. Hayes," he said. his voice dropping its friendly pretense and adopting a cold, hard edge. "If you refuse to sign that document, I will personally inject this into your neck. You will spend the next 72 hours locked in a chemically induced nightmare. When you wake up, you will not even remember your own name, let alone the address of your precious house. I can keep injecting you legally until your brain actually turns to mush. It is entirely your choice. Sign the paper and walk out the front door or become a permanent resident of my intensive care ward." The threat was explicit and violent. He was ready to destroy my mind for a paycheck. I knew the digital recorder in my pocket was capturing every single syllable. But I needed more. I needed him to definitively tie the Albright family to this extortion. I let my shoulders slump forward, intentionally breaking my rigid posture. I forced my hands to shake violently, knocking the gold pen off the table. It clattered loudly against the floor. "Please," I stammered, pitching my voice up to sound frail and utterly terrified. "Please do not give me that medicine, doctor. I do not know what is happening to me lately. Sometimes I forget where I am. Sometimes I see things that are not there. My memory is slipping away, just like the court papers said." I rubbed my face furiously, letting out a weak, pathetic sob. "I am just a confused old man. Why are you doing this to me? I do not understand who wants my house this badly." Thorne smiled, an ugly, triumphant expression. He set the syringe down on the table, clearly satisfied that his threat had broken the old black mechanic. He leaned in close, his expensive cologne invading my personal space. "It is nothing personal, Xavier," he said, adopting a mockingly sympathetic tone. "You are just in the way of progress. Your daughter-in-law, Megan Albright, is a very determined woman. She and your son, Kendrick, paid a premium for my discretion. Megan made it explicitly clear that she wants that Brooklyn property transferred to her father's real estate trust by the end of business today. She does not care if you end up in a straitjacket to make it happen. She arranged the police. She arranged the ambulance. I am just the medical professional facilitating her vision. You should have just signed the tax papers at your birthday party, old man. Now pick up the pen and sign the transfer before I lose my patience and sedate you." I had it. The absolute confirmation. Megan Albright ordered a fraudulent medical kidnapping and extortion. The violent trembling in my hands stopped instantly. I sat up perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back. My posture shifted from a broken victim to the primary shareholder of a $400 million shadow empire. I looked Thorne directly in his eyes. The transition was so abrupt and absolute that the arrogant smirk froze on his face. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my wool coat. I bypassed the voice recorder and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. I did not take his gold pen. Instead, I opened my envelope and slid a thick watermarked document across the metal table right over Megan's property transfer. "Read it," I commanded, my voice booming with unquestionable authority. Thorne frowned deeply, completely thrown off balance by my sudden shift in demeanor. He picked up the paper. It was not a medical chart. It was a specialized legal injunction drafted at 3 a.m. by Jonathan Reed and his army of corporate lawyers. Thorne began to read. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed. His hands, the same hands that just threatened to poison me, began to shake violently. The document was an emergency executive order issued directly from the state medical board and expedited by the governor's office. Jonathan had used his profound political leverage and the massive financial weight of my anonymous trust to secure it. It detailed immediate and total revocation of Dr. Eris Thorne's medical license pending a federal investigation into insurance fraud, illegal psychiatric detentions, and extortion. It also carried a mandate to freeze all clinic operational accounts. "You are not a doctor anymore, Aris," I said coldly. "You are an unemployed criminal sitting in a room with a man who holds enough financial and political power to ensure you spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. My legal team already dispatched the Federal Bureau of Investigation to your front lobby. They are seizing your servers and locking down your facility as we speak. I recorded every single threat you just made. I recorded you admitting to taking bribes from Megan Albright. I recorded your intent to administer illegal chemical sedatives. Your entire career has just been vaporized." Thorne dropped the paper as if it were burning his skin. The heavy glass syringe rolled off the table and shattered on the floor, spilling the cloudy liquid across the tiles. He looked at me, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He collapsed onto his knees, his expensive white lab coat bunching up on the sterile floor. "Please, Mr. Hayes," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "Please, you have to understand. The Albrights are powerful people. They pressured me. I can help you. I can testify against Megan. I can give you all the communication logs. I will be your star witness. Just please do not let the federal agents take me away." I did not bother looking down at him. A man who sells his medical oath to torture the elderly does not deserve a second of my pity. I reached across the table and grabbed his sleek leather folder. It contained the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation Megan had submitted and the forged transfer deed. I tucked the entire folder securely under my arm, protecting the undeniable physical proof of their conspiracy. "These are my medical records," I stated flatly. "I am taking them for my upcoming court date. Do not try to leave the building, heiress. The agents in the lobby have a warrant for your immediate arrest." I turned my back on the weeping doctor and walked out of the examination room. The hallway was no longer quiet. I could hear the loud, commanding voices of federal agents swarming the reception area. I walked right past them, stepping out the front glass doors into the brisk morning air, leaving the burning ruins of his clinic behind me. I left the clinic and immediately drove to a secure location to meet with Jonathan. The fraudulent medical proxy was completely dead, but we needed to know exactly how desperate Kendrick was. Jonathan had a high-level contact, a former intelligence operative who now specialized in ruthless corporate espionage. We paid him a massive premium to bypass the state-of-the-art security at Kendrick's prestigious investment bank. That same night, while the overnight cleaning crew swept through the executive floors, the operative slipped undetected into my son's corner office. He planted a micro-audio transmitter directly under the heavy mahogany desk. The device was virtually undetectable to standard security sweeps. It was designed to capture a whisper from 30 feet away. I wanted to hear every single panicked phone call, every argument, and every desperate move my son was making behind closed doors. The live audio feed was routed securely through encrypted servers directly to a specialized application on my phone. I sat in my temporary motel room testing the connection. The sound of Kendrick's office air conditioning hummed softly in my earpiece. I needed to map out his entire criminal network before I brought the hammer down on his life. The trap was perfectly positioned. Now all I had to do was wait for the rats to start turning on each other. As I sat in the dim light of the motel room staring at the silent audio waveform on my glowing screen, my mind drifted back to when Kendrick was just a teenager. He used to wrinkle his nose in absolute disgust whenever I walked into the house after a 14-hour shift at the garage. He hated the smell of motor oil and industrial grease that clung to my skin. He constantly told me that I smelled like poverty, like endless struggle, and like a life he was desperate to escape. I remember him looking at my permanently stained hands and making a solemn vow that he would never work a job that required him to scrub dirt from his fingernails. He wanted clean hands and sterile environments. He wanted to sit in climate-controlled glass towers and look down at the rest of the world. And he got exactly what he wanted. Today, he wears custom-tailored Italian wool suits that cost $3,000 apiece. He gets weekly manicures and wears imported cologne that costs more than my first set of mechanic tools. His hands are perfectly clean, but his soul is entirely rotten to the core. He traded the honest grime of hard physical labor for the invisible filth of corporate theft and massive gambling debts. I worked myself to the bone, ruining my back and my knees so he could attend the best universities. I gave him the financial and moral foundation to build a life of absolute honor. Instead, he used that foundation to build a fragile monument to his own greed and arrogance. He was so deeply ashamed of where he came from that he gladly sold out his own father to protect his fabricated high society image. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. My hands might have been stained with engine grease, but every single dollar I earned was honest and clean. His hands were spotless, but every dollar he touched was covered in deception and blood. The next afternoon, the silent audio feed suddenly crackled to life with alarming intensity. I quickly put on my headphones and turned up the volume to maximum. The heavy oak door of Kendrick's office slammed shut with enough force to rattle the microphone. Megan's voice cut through the static, sharp, vicious, and completely furious. She was pacing the floor rapidly, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood. "What do you mean the psychiatric clinic was raided?" she screamed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "I paid Dr. Thorne $50,000 from my personal account to secure that medical proxy. How in the hell did the federal agents get involved?" Kendrick's voice trembled violently as he replied. He sounded absolutely nothing like the confident, arrogant vice president he pretended to be in public. "I do not know, Megan," he stammered. Thorne is currently in federal custody, and the entire proxy is completely void. We do not have the house. We cannot liquidate the property to your father's trust. Megan threw something heavy across the room. It shattered violently against the wall. You are absolutely useless, Kendrick, she hissed with pure venom. My father is expecting the signed deed to that Brooklyn property by Friday to finalize his gentrification block. I promised him we had the asset secured. Now I look like a complete fool in front of the board. In sheer panic. He is not our biggest problem right now, Megan. The Volkov Syndicate is the real problem. They called my private line again this morning. They do not care about the house anymore. They want their $2 million in clean cash by the end of the week, or they are going to send their enforcers to our condo. They know exactly where you sleep, Megan. They know where your wealthy parents live. We are completely out of time. Megan laughed, a cold, terrifyingly cruel sound. This is your disgusting gambling debt, Kendrick. Do not dare drag my influential family into your pathetic addiction. Fix this mess immediately, or I am filing for divorce and letting the Russians deal with you personally. The lavish office went dead silent for several agonizing seconds. When Kendrick finally spoke again, his voice was reduced to a desperate, broken whisper, but the high-grade microphone caught every single terrifying syllable perfectly. I am already fixing it. He confessed, his breathing heavy and erratic. I have been secretly skimming capital from the senior client retirement portfolios for the past month. I illegally diverted $500,000 yesterday afternoon. I am transferring another $1.5 million tomorrow morning right before the quarterly bank audits run. Megan gasped sharply, not out of any moral outrage, but out of sheer shock at the monumental risk he was taking. You are actively embezzling from your own banking clients, she asked, her tone shifting from angry to absolutely horrified. If the Federal Compliance Board catches you, they will lock you away in a federal prison for decades. I have absolutely no other choice, Kendrick snapped back defensively. I can hide the fraudulent transfers in the offshore shell accounts just long enough to pay off the Volkovs. Once the immediate heat is off, I will figure out how to artificially balance the bank ledgers. I sat frozen, gripping the edge of the motel desk. My son was not just a traitor to his own family. He was a ruthless corporate predator. He was actively stealing the hard-earned life savings of innocent elderly people to pay off a violent Russian crime syndicate. The trap was perfectly set, and he had just handed me the final devastating nail for his own coffin. The very next morning, I parked my rusted truck down the block from my house in Brooklyn. I sat low in the driver's seat, watching through a pair of heavy binoculars. A fleet of sleek white commercial vans pulled up to the curb. The bright logo on the side panels read, Albright Luxury Developments. Megan stepped out of the lead vehicle holding a digital tablet and a steaming cup of expensive coffee. She was wearing a designer jacket and pointing aggressively at the facade of my property. A massive crew of 12 construction workers unloaded heavy sledgehammers, pry bars, and industrial demolition equipment. They did not have legal permits. They did not have the rightful deed to the property, but Megan operated under the arrogant assumption that extreme wealth and political connections made her completely immune to the law. She wanted to erase every trace of my existence from that property as fast as possible. She directed the foreman to start tearing down the front porch immediately. I watched them rip up the varnished wood planks I had carefully maintained just last summer. They tossed the splintered pieces into a massive metal dumpster parked directly on my front lawn. She was transforming the home I built into a sterile modern monstrosity to flip for a massive profit. She stood on the sidewalk laughing loudly on her cell phone, completely oblivious to the fact that I was watching her every single move. The physical destruction of my property was just another casual business transaction to her. Then the foreman led a team to the side garden. My chest tightened so hard I could barely draw a breath. There was a low, red brick wall enclosing the vibrant flower beds. Evelyn built that wall with her own 2 hands exactly 20 years ago. She spent an entire summer mixing the heavy cement mortar and setting each brick perfectly into place. Her knees were bruised and her hands were heavily blistered, but she refused my help because she wanted to create something permanent for our family. It was a beautiful monument to her relentless dedication and her profound love for our home. Megan pointed her manicured finger directly at Evelyn's wall. I watched through the binoculars as a burly worker raised a heavy steel sledgehammer high above his head. He swung again and again, reducing decades. He swung again and again, reducing decades of my late wife's physical labor to a pathetic pile of dusty red rubble. Megan did not even flinch. She just took a sip of her coffee and typed something into her digital tablet. My heart broke into 1,000 jagged pieces. The grief hit me first, a suffocating wave of pure sorrow for the utter disrespect shown to the woman who gave Kendrick his very life. But the grief evaporated in a matter of seconds. It was instantly replaced by a rage so pure and absolute it felt like liquid fire running through my veins. They were not just stealing an expensive financial asset. They were actively spitting on the grave of a good black woman who sacrificed everything for them. I lowered the binoculars and placed them carefully on the passenger seat. My hands were perfectly steady. The time for gathering evidence and acting like a vulnerable victim was officially over. I was going to strip them of everything they held dear, and I was going to start with the very foundation of Megan's arrogant existence. I started the engine of my truck and drove away from the demolition site. I did not drive to the police station to report the trespassing. The police could only stop the physical destruction of the wood and the bricks. I wanted to obliterate their entire financial reality. I headed straight back to the secure penthouse office at Obsidian Wealth Management in Manhattan. Mr. Sterling was waiting for me at the private elevator. I bypassed all the pleasantries and walked directly into the secure, soundproof conference room. I instructed Sterling to initiate a heavily encrypted global conference call immediately. Within 2 minutes, the massive digital screens illuminated the dark room. The shadows and blurred silhouettes of the 5 primary board members of the Vanguard Trust appeared on the glowing monitors. These were anonymous billionaires, offshore power brokers, and ruthless corporate liquidators who operated strictly under my direct command. They knew me only as the majority shareholder, the man who had guided their massive investments to absolute perfection for the last 40 years. "Gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice devoid of any emotion, "we are shifting our immediate acquisition strategy today. I want a total mobilization of our liquid capital reserves across all shadow accounts." The board members remained silent, waiting for my precise directive. They knew a sudden shift of this magnitude meant a hostile takeover was imminent. I pulled up the detailed financial dossier on Albright Luxury Developments, the massive real estate empire owned entirely by Megan's father. The company projected an image of absolute financial dominance, but my earlier forensic audits had revealed their fatal weakness. They were dangerously over-leveraged. They relied heavily on toxic short-term loans and high-risk commercial mortgages to fund their rapid expansion into gentrified Brooklyn neighborhoods. They were swimming in bad corporate debt, hiding cleverly behind their wealthy society reputation. They thought they were completely untouchable because their creditors were scattered across dozens of smaller regional banks. They were completely wrong. I looked at the exact figures on the screen. The Albright family owed millions to various lenders who were desperate to offload the risk. I was about to become their worst nightmare. I was going to weaponize their own toxic debt against them. I took a deep breath and prepared to deliver the final execution order. I pointed at the complex financial schematics displaying the Albright corporate structure. "I want Vanguard Trust to aggressively purchase every single outstanding loan, high-risk mortgage, and line of credit associated with Albright Luxury Developments," I commanded. "Buy the debt from the regional banks at a premium if you have to. I do not care about the upfront cost. Consolidate every single cent of their financial liabilities directly under our primary holding company. I want absolute control over their corporate survival by the end of the business week." One of the shadow board members finally spoke, his voice digitally altered to protect his identity. "That is over $50 million in high-risk toxic debt, sir. If we assume those liabilities, we become their sole creditor." "Exactly," I replied, a cold smile forming on my face. "By Friday morning, I want to be the undisputed owner of the Albright family. When they default on their next massive payment, and they will absolutely default, we will have the absolute legal authority to seize their entire company, liquidate their personal assets, and completely dismantle their legacy. Proceed with the acquisitions immediately." I terminated the encrypted connection and the screens went dark. Megan wanted to destroy my home with a sledgehammer. I was going to demolish her entire bloodline with a single stroke of a pen. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old man. They had no idea they just handed the keys to their empire over to a ghost. Just 2 days after the demolition crew tore apart Evelyn's garden, Megan decided to host a lavish housewarming party. She wanted to celebrate her newest real estate acquisition with her high society friends. The narrow street was completely choked with luxury European sports cars and massive black SUVs. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to open doors for women draped in designer silk and men wearing tailored suits that cost more than a college education. They walked up the newly poured concrete steps, completely ignoring the fact that my sweat and blood were embedded in the very soil beneath their expensive leather shoes. Loud electronic jazz music thumped against the original stained glass windows I had carefully restored 10 years ago. Caterers in pristine uniforms carried silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne through my front door. The audacity of it all was staggering. They were actively dancing on the grave of my stolen legacy. Megan had hired a massive lighting crew to illuminate the facade, projecting a sickeningly bright white light over the architectural bones of a home built by a working-class black family. She wanted to show her wealthy circle how quickly she could gentrify a property. She treated my home like a conquered territory, parading her victory for everyone to see. Kendrick was there too, standing near the entrance, greeting the guests with a practiced smile. He held a crystal glass tight in his hand, trying to look like he belonged among these elite predators. But I knew the truth. He was a desperate man drowning in massive debt, pretending to be a king in a stolen castle. Inside the house, Megan held court in the exact center of the living room. The original oak floors I had sanded and stained by hand were now heavily scuffed by the sharp heels of dozens of wealthy strangers. She clinked her champagne flute against a silver spoon, demanding the absolute attention of the crowded room. "Thank you all for coming to our newest project," she announced, her voice echoing off the walls. "I have to admit, securing this prime Brooklyn real estate was an absolute steal." The crowd chuckled, leaning in to hear her story. She took a sip of her expensive drink and smiled wickedly. The previous owner was this incredibly stubborn, senile old man. He let the place fall into absolute ruin. You would not believe the filthy garbage we had to clear out. He was completely out of his mind, clutching onto worthless junk and standing in the way of real progress. The guests gasped in mock horror, shaking their heads in synchronized disgust. Megan continued her performance, feeding on their undivided attention. Luckily, we managed to convince the poor guy to hand over the medical proxy before he completely lost his marbles. We got the entire property for a tiny fraction of its actual market value. Honestly, we did the old fool a massive favor by pushing him out to the streets. He belongs in a state medical facility, not managing $1 million asset. The crowd erupted into loud applause and arrogant laughter, raising their glasses to toast her brilliant business acumen. They praised her heavily for cleaning up the neighborhood, for pushing out the undesirable elements and increasing their collective property values. Kendrick stood right beside her, listening to his wife publicly humiliate his own father. He did not say a single word in my defense. He just offered a weak, cowardly smile and raised his glass to join the toxic toast. He sold his soul to fit into a world that would never truly accept him. I heard every single vicious word she spoke. I was sitting in the cold, dark cabin of my rusted Ford truck, parked discreetly in a shadowy alley just 1 block away from the party. The dashboard was completely dark, but my face was illuminated by the harsh blue glow of my digital tablet. When I upgraded the home security system 2 years ago, I did not just install standard cameras on the front porch. I had custom micro lenses embedded directly into the living room crown molding and the dining room chandeliers. They were highly sophisticated devices designed to blend perfectly with the vintage aesthetics of the house. Megan's overpriced demolition crew completely missed them during their initial sweep. The live feed streamed crystal-clear video and high-definition audio directly to my secure device. I watched them laugh loudly at my expense. I watched them drink expensive champagne over the metaphorical corpse of my entire life savings. I saw the exact spot where Evelyn's favorite rocking chair used to sit, now occupied by a pretentious real estate developer bragging about local market yields. The anger inside me had distilled into something far more potent than blind rage. It was absolute freezing clarity. I studied the faces of the arrogant guests. I recognized several powerful figures from the Manhattan financial district. These were the very people who held the purse strings to the Albright family empire. Megan thought she was proving her financial dominance to them. She had no idea she was actively hosting a massive party on a rapidly sinking ship. My fingers hovered over the screen, tracing the smug outline of my son. He was sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning. He kept checking his phone, his eyes darting nervously toward the heavy front door. The Volkov Syndicate deadline was approaching extremely fast, and he was running out of time to liquidate the stolen house. He was trapped in a horrific nightmare of his own making, surrounded by fake friends who would abandon him the second his bank accounts ran dry. I let them enjoy their false victory for a few more minutes. I wanted them to feel entirely untouchable. I wanted their arrogance to peak perfectly so the inevitable fall would shatter them completely. I closed the security application on my tablet and picked up my encrypted mobile phone. I dialed Jonathan Reed's direct private line. He answered immediately, the background noise of his busy legal war room humming quietly over the speaker. Xavier Jonathan said, his voice sharp and fully prepared for action. Vanguard Trust has officially secured 92% of the Albright family toxic debt. The transition of ownership is legally binding and entirely locked in. We possess the absolute legal authority to call in the margins whenever you give the word. I looked out the windshield toward the bright lights of my stolen house, illuminating the dark Brooklyn sky. The loud bass of the electronic music vibrated through the damp night air. Execute Phase 1, I commanded, my voice dropping to a lethal, unyielding calm. Freeze all of Kendrick's corporate banking privileges instantly. Flag his high-limit credit cards for immediate extreme fraud review. I want every single dollar he has access to locked down right now. And Jonathan, I added, gripping the leather steering wheel tightly, make sure the private catering company processing the payments for that party runs his card in exactly 5 minutes. Understood, Mr. Hayes. Jonathan replied, the distinct sound of keyboard clacking echoing through the phone. The financial locks are being actively engaged right now. Let the games begin. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I leaned back against the worn fabric of my truck, preparing to watch the digital feed again. The greedy vultures were busy feasting on what they thought was a dead carcass. They were about to discover the absolute terror of being hunted. I sat in the dark cabin of my truck watching the live feed on my tablet. The extravagant party was in full swing. The catering manager, a sharp-looking man in a black vest, approached Kendrick. He held a sleek digital payment terminal. The initial deposit for the imported caviar and vintage champagne had been cleared days ago, but the open bar tab had reached its limit. Kendrick smiled confidently, trying to impress a group of Manhattan real estate developers standing nearby. He reached into his tailored Italian suit jacket and pulled out a heavy metal black credit card. It was the ultimate status symbol for a fake corporate elite. He tapped the card against the screen with an arrogant flick of his wrist. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds. Then it emitted a loud, sharp beep. A bright red error message flashed across the digital screen. Declined. Kendrick frowned. He chuckled nervously and told the manager to try it again, claiming it must be a simple network error. The manager swiped the heavy metal card. Beep. Declined. Please use another form of payment, sir, the manager said, his professional tone carrying just enough edge to be heard by the people standing closest to the bar. Kendrick patted his pockets, his face suddenly losing its relaxed confidence. He pulled out a secondary platinum card and inserted the chip. Beep. Declined. Fraud alert block. The music was still thumping, but the silence around the catering station grew incredibly loud. Wealthy people have a primal instinct for smelling financial blood in the water. The group of developers stopped laughing and exchanged highly judgmental glances. Whispers started rippling through the immediate crowd. Megan noticed the sudden shift in the room atmosphere. She marched over to her husband, her designer heels clicking sharply against my hardwood floors. "What is the holdup, Kendrick?" she demanded, snatching the platinum card from his hand. "Are we seriously holding up the champagne service for our guests?" Kendrick lowered his voice to a frantic whisper, trying to contain the absolute disaster. "The cards are locked, Megan. The bank is declining everything." Megan's face turned a violently bright shade of red. The polished high society mask instantly shattered. She turned her fury directly onto the catering manager. "Your machine is obviously broken," she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. "Do you have any idea who we are? Run the card again, or I will ensure your catering company never books another event in this city." The manager stood his ground, perfectly calm. "Madam, the terminal is working flawlessly," he replied, holding the screen up for her to see. "Your financial institution has explicitly placed a hard freeze on these accounts. I remember when Kendrick was a little boy, I taught him that a man's true wealth was measured by his composure under pressure. We had almost nothing back then, but we had our dignity. We paid for our groceries with crumpled bills and counted every single penny. Now my son stood frozen in a $3,000 suit, completely emasculated, while his arrogant wife threw a childish public tantrum over declined credit cards. The guests were no longer just whispering. They were openly staring. The grand illusion of the Albright and Hayes empire was cracking right in front of their elite circle. Megan grabbed Kendrick by the arm, her nails digging into his expensive fabric, and dragged him toward the kitchen, away from the prying eyes of their wealthy friends. I switched the audio feed on my tablet from the living room chandelier to the hidden microphone above the kitchen island. The kitchen was empty of guests, but filled with the suffocating tension of two collapsing egos. Kendrick pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it on the granite countertop before fumbling to dial the premium banking concierge line. Megan paced like a caged animal, biting her perfectly painted lips. "Fix this right now, Kendrick," she hissed. "My father has potential investors in the living room, and you are making us look like completely broke frauds." Kendrick put the phone on speaker. A crisp, automated voice transitioned to a live banking representative. "This is Obsidian Wealth Management high-tier support," the agent said. "How can I assist you, Mr. Hayes? My cards are entirely blocked," Kendrick shouted, his voice cracking with pure panic. "I am hosting a massive corporate event and you are declining my transactions. Lift the restriction immediately." There was a brief silence on the line, accompanied by the rapid clacking of a computer keyboard. "Mr. Hayes," the agent replied, her tone shifting into a cold, strict professional register. "I am looking at your portfolio now. All of your personal and corporate accounts have been placed under a Level 4 security lockdown. There is an active federal and internal compliance investigation regarding unauthorized capital diversions from your senior client retirement portfolios. You no longer have access to any liquid assets, lines of credit, or margin accounts." Kendrick turned the color of ash. He gripped the edge of the granite counter to stop his knees from buckling completely. "What do you mean, federal investigation?" he choked out. The agent remained absolutely detached. "We received an anonymous high-priority fraud dossier 2 hours ago, including direct offshore wire trace evidence. Your banking privileges are permanently revoked pending law enforcement review. Please expect to be contacted by federal authorities. Have a good evening." The line went dead. Kendrick stared at the phone. He was officially ruined. He had been caught stealing from the elderly to pay the Russian mob. I watched my son slide down the expensive kitchen cabinets until he hit the floor, burying his face in his hands. Megan stood frozen, her eyes wide with absolute horror as the reality of their complete financial destruction finally registered. I sat in my truck watching the digital feed of their total meltdown. The first financial stab was flawlessly executed, but the bleeding was only just beginning. I looked up from my tablet and focused my eyes on the actual street outside my house. The sleek European sports cars belonging to Megan's guests lined the curb, but a new vehicle was aggressively turning the corner. It was a massive, heavily tinted black SUV. It did not search for a polite parking spot. It violently hopped the curb and parked directly on the freshly manicured grass of my front lawn, crushing the expensive landscaping Megan had just installed. The heavy doors of the SUV opened simultaneously. 2 massive men stepped out into the humid night air. They were dressed in dark leather jackets tightly fitted over broad, muscular shoulders. They did not look like wealthy real estate developers or corporate bankers. They moved with the silent, predatory grace of professional enforcers. It was the Volkov Syndicate. They did not care about the housewarming party, the loud music, or the elite guests standing on the porch. They walked straight up the concrete steps, shoving a valet driver brutally out of their path. Kendrick had promised them $2 million in clean cash, and his accounts were now locked down by federal investigators. Time was completely up. I rolled down the window of my rusted truck just a fraction to hear the commotion outside. The heavy oak door of my house swung open. The true nightmare for Kendrick and Megan had officially arrived. I watched the 2 Volkov enforcers push past the terrified party guests and walk straight into my house. The live audio feed in my earpiece picked up their heavy boots echoing down the hardwood hallway toward the kitchen. Kendrick was still sitting on the floor, completely paralyzed by the banking phone call. The larger of the 2 men grabbed Kendrick by his expensive silk lapels and hauled him to his feet effortlessly. "You promised us $2 million today," Kendrick the enforcer growled, his thick Eastern European accent cutting through the thick tension. "We do not like waiting for our money." Megan pressed her back against the granite countertops, trembling violently, as the brutal reality of her husband's hidden debts invaded her perfectly curated life. Kendrick stammered out pathetic excuses, begging for just a few more days, claiming a massive real estate deal was about to close. The enforcer did not argue. He simply smiled a cold, dead smile and dropped Kendrick back onto the tile floor. "Words are completely useless to us now," the enforcer said casually, adjusting his leather jacket. "We will take a small down payment tonight just to remind you exactly who owns your life." The two men walked out of the kitchen, ignoring the horrified stares of the wealthy elite guests. They stepped off the front porch and walked directly toward Megan's prized possession. It was a brand new imported luxury sports car parked illegally near the driveway. One of the men casually pulled a heavy steel baton from his dark jacket. Without a single word, he swung it down violently against the sleek windshield of Megan's luxury car. The expensive safety glass shattered, instantly echoing like a loud gunshot down the quiet Brooklyn street. He struck the vehicle again and again, destroying the custom headlights, caving in the passenger doors, and completely obliterating the pristine hood. Megan ran out onto the front porch, screaming hysterically as she watched her $200,000 status symbol reduced to absolute scrap metal in a matter of seconds. Her elite friends did not step in to help her. They rushed to their own vehicles, desperate to flee the violent scene before the police arrived. The facade of the Albright and Hayes power couple was entirely dead. The next morning, the devastation continued. Megan tried to escape the profound humiliation of the ruined housewarming party by fleeing to her high-end fashion boutique on Fifth Avenue. Her wealthy father had bought her the premium retail space as a lavish wedding gift. She never had to scrub a single floor or balance a legitimate financial ledger to earn it. She just pointed her manicured finger and the retail empire was handed to her on a silver platter. I remember my late wife Evelyn sewing late into the night until her fingers physically bled just to afford my first set of professional mechanic tools. We built our lives on genuine, relentless sacrifice, while Megan built hers on unearned privilege. But privilege is a highly flammable illusion. I sat in my temporary executive office at Obsidian Wealth Management, sipping black coffee as my legal team executed the next phase of the financial slaughter. Megan arrived at her boutique expecting the comforting smell of expensive leather and subservient employees. Instead, she found the heavy glass doors padlocked shut with thick steel chains. A massive, bright orange eviction notice was pasted directly across the front display window. Megan frantically pulled out her phone and called the building management company, screaming aggressively about the padlock. The property manager informed her that the anonymous holding company owning the commercial block had suddenly terminated her lease, citing a strict zero-tolerance policy for tenants associated with federal fraud investigations. Vanguard Trust. My own shadow corporation was her anonymous landlord. I had just legally erased her entire professional identity with a single automated email. She was no longer a prominent Fifth Avenue boutique owner. She was just an unemployed, angry woman standing on the sidewalk staring at her locked doors. She stormed back to the Brooklyn house in a blind rage. The hidden microphone in the living room captured the explosive collision between husband and wife. The pristine house was a complete disaster area littered with half-empty champagne glasses and the lingering dread of the Russian mob attack. "You are an absolute failure," Kendrick Megan screamed, throwing her heavy designer handbag across the room. "My beautiful car is destroyed, my elite guests saw us attacked by literal gangsters, and now my boutique has been seized because your pathetic banking crimes leaked to my landlord. I married a prestigious investment banker, not a degenerate gambling addict." Kendrick fired back, his voice dripping with pure desperation and venom. "Do not act like you are an innocent victim, Megan. You were perfectly happy to forge medical records and steal my father's house when you thought it would fund your lavish lifestyle. We are both going down for this federal crime unless we get that $2 million today." The foundation of their marriage was built entirely on greed, and without money, it instantly crumbled into toxic hatred. Kendrick was entirely cornered. The federal authorities had frozen his legitimate accounts. The mob was threatening his physical safety. In a moment of absolute panic, he did the only thing a cowardly son knows how to do. He reached for his phone to call the father he had tried to permanently destroy. I sat in the executive office watching my encrypted cell phone light up with his caller identification. I let it ring 3 times. I pictured his sweaty, desperate face, hoping I would pick up and blindly offer him my life savings to save him from prison. I calmly pressed the red button, declining the call and permanently blocking his number. The profound silence on his end of the line must have felt like a severe physical blow. Kendrick dropped his phone onto the couch, realizing he was completely cut off from his final lifeline. He had thrown away a father who would have moved heaven and earth for him, and now he was entirely alone with the wolves. Megan watched him fail and let out a vicious, mocking laugh. "You cannot even get your senile old father to answer a simple phone call," she spat, her voice shaking with desperate rage. "Get out of my way, Kendrick. I have to fix this massive disaster myself." She picked up her own phone and dialed a number on speed dial. It was her father, the mighty chief executive officer of Albright Luxury Developments. "Dad," she cried instantly, shifting her tone into that of a terrified, helpless daughter. "Everything is completely falling apart. We need cash immediately. You have to expedite the transfer of the Brooklyn property today. I do not care what the corporate lawyers say. Force the board to approve the liquidation of Xavier Hayes' house this afternoon, or we are going to lose everything." I listened to her seal her own fate. She thought my house was her absolute salvation. She was demanding her father pull the trigger on a transaction that would bring their entire $50 million empire crashing straight down into my waiting hands. Richard Albright sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table in his Manhattan headquarters. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of untouchable wealth. But this morning, his tailored suit felt like a straitjacket. His chief financial officer had just delivered a terrifying report. A massive, anonymous shadow corporation known only as Vanguard Trust had aggressively purchased over 90% of their outstanding corporate debt in a matter of 48 hours. Richard did not know who controlled Vanguard Trust, but he knew what it meant when a single entity cornered your liabilities. It meant a hostile takeover was imminent. He was bleeding cash rapidly, and his traditional banking allies had suddenly stopped returning his phone calls. When his daughter Megan called him screaming in absolute panic about needing to liquidate the Brooklyn property, immediately Richard saw a desperate lifeline. He believed selling that gentrified block would generate just enough immediate liquid capital to appease his mysterious new creditors. He ordered an emergency board meeting for noon, demanding all senior partners attend to rubber stamp the expedited sale of my home. Back in Brooklyn, Megan and Kendrick were preparing for the meeting that they believed would magically erase their horrific nightmare. I watched them through the hidden bedroom camera. The arrogant glamour they had projected just 2 nights ago was completely gone. Kendrick pulled a wrinkled suit from the closet. His hands shook so violently he could barely button his own shirt. He had not slept a single minute. The terrifying reality of the federal banking investigation and the looming threat of the Russian mob had hollowed out his face. He looked like a dead man walking. Megan was in no better shape. She frantically applied thick layers of expensive makeup, trying to hide the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. Their pristine luxury car was a shattered pile of glass and dented metal sitting on the front lawn. They were forced to call a cheap local taxi to drive them to Manhattan. They sat in the back of the cab in complete silence, physically repulsed by the smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. They were entirely stripped of their unearned dignity. I sat in the luxurious executive suite at Obsidian Wealth Management, preparing for my own departure. My personal tailor had just finished adjusting the final measurements on my charcoal gray, bespoke suit. I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. I did not look like the tired old mechanic who wore grease-stained overalls for 40 years. I looked like the apex predator of the financial food chain. Looking at the immaculate stitching on my cuffs, my mind drifted back to Kendrick's middle school graduation. I had taken extra overnight shifts at the auto shop for 2 straight months just to afford a high-quality tailored suit for him. I wanted my black son to stand on that stage looking just as sharp and dignified as the wealthy white kids in his class. I sacrificed my own body to give him a shield of armor against a harsh world. I bought him that suit so he would never have to feel inferior. Now he was putting on his expensive suits to actively destroy the man who bought him his first one. The profound heartbreak of that memory fueled the cold, unyielding fire in my chest. I adjusted my silk tie and signaled to Jonathan Reed. It was time to execute the final corporate slaughter. The boardroom at Albright Luxury Developments was thick with suffocating tension. Richard Albright stood at the head of the table, surrounded by 6 heavily sweating executives. The panoramic windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, but nobody was looking outside. They were all staring at the grim financial projections displayed on the central monitor. Megan and Kendrick burst through the heavy glass doors, interrupting the chief financial officer. Megan marched straight to the table, demanding immediate attention. Her voice was shrill and completely devoid of professional decorum. "Dad, we need the cash transfer from the Brooklyn property finalized right now," she insisted, slamming her designer purse onto the polished mahogany. Kendrick is facing severe legal complications and my boutique was illegally padlocked this morning. I need my share of the liquidation immediately." Richard glared at his daughter, his face flushed with extreme stress. "Sit down and shut up." "Megan," he barked, his usual indulgent tone completely replaced by corporate panic. "You are not the only one drowning here. We are pushing the residential sale through the board right now. As soon as the deed transfers to the corporate trust, we can leverage it for a massive emergency loan. It is the only thing keeping this entire company from filing for bankruptcy by the end of the week." Kendrick sank into a leather chair, wiping a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead. He truly believed he was inches away from salvation. He believed my stolen house was going to pay off the Russian mob and keep him out of federal prison. They placed the fraudulent property transfer documents in the exact center of the table. Richard picked up his expensive gold pen, preparing to sign the executive authorization that would legally absorb my home into his failing empire. He raised the pen, confident that his wealth and power could pave over any obstacle. He thought he was playing a winning hand. He did not know the game had already ended. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a violent metallic crash. The sudden noise echoed like a gunshot, stopping Richard dead in his tracks. Every single executive at the table whipped their heads around in profound shock. I walked into the room. I moved with slow, deliberate, and absolute authority. My charcoal bespoke suit fit perfectly, radiating silent, immense power. Jonathan Reed walked one step behind my right shoulder, holding a thick black leather briefcase. Two massive armed security contractors from Obsidian Wealth Management flanked us, securing the doorway and blocking any possible exit. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Megan was the first to break the quiet. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of utter confusion and venomous disgust. She completely failed to process the transformation standing in front of her. To her, I was just the pathetic, senile old black man she had kicked out into the rain. "What the hell are you doing here?" she shrieked, her voice breaking the professional atmosphere. "How did you get past security? Get out of this building before I have you arrested for trespassing." She turned to the executives, pointing a manicured finger at me. "This is the crazy old man I told you about, the one who lost his mind. Call the police immediately." I did not stop walking. I did not even look at her. I walked directly toward the head of the table, fixing my gaze entirely on Richard Albright. The executives scrambled out of their chairs, intimidated by the sheer physical presence of my security team and the cold, lethal confidence radiating from my posture. Kendrick looked up from his chair, the color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He recognized Jonathan Reed instantly. Everyone in the Manhattan Financial District knew Jonathan Reed. He was the corporate Grim Reaper. If Reed was in your boardroom, your company was already dead. Richard Albright gripped his gold pen, his hands trembling slightly. "Who do you think you are, barging into a private board meeting?" Richard demanded, trying unsuccessfully to project authority. "Security is on the way. You are making a massive mistake, old man." I stopped at the exact opposite end of the mahogany table. I placed both of my hands flat on the polished wood, mirroring the exact aggressive stance Megan had used against me on my birthday. "I am not making a mistake, Richard," I said, my voice echoing smoothly across the massive room. "I am just here to collect my property." I gestured slightly with my left hand. Jonathan stepped forward, placing the heavy black leather briefcase directly on top of the fraudulent property transfer documents. He popped the metal latches open. The sharp click sounded like a guillotine dropping. Jonathan pulled out a massive stack of certified financial contracts and spread them deliberately across the table for every executive to see. "Allow me to introduce my client," Jonathan announced, his voice dripping with lethal professional precision. "This is Mr. Xavier Hayes. He is the primary owner and sole managing director of Vanguard Trust. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Mr. Hayes legally holds 96% of all outstanding debt associated with Albright Luxury Developments. He is your primary creditor, your anonymous landlord, and the absolute owner of this entire corporate structure." Richard Albright choked on his own breath. The gold pen slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against the table. He stared at the certified documents, his eyes scanning the aggressive buyout signatures. The realization hit him with the destructive force of a freight train. The mysterious billionaire who had systematically cornered his entire empire was the exact same man his daughter had tried to throw onto the street. Megan stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. Kendrick slid completely out of his chair, dropping onto his knees on the carpeted floor. The illusion was shattered. The slaughter had officially begun. Richard Albright reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the thick stack of financial contracts closer to his chest. He flipped through the crisp pages, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal paragraphs and the undeniable notarized seals. The total liability figure printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the master ledger was staggering. $50 million. It was all immediately callable. Megan finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She slammed her hands violently against the mahogany table, her perfectly manicured nails scraping against the polished wood. "This is an absolute lie," she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the silent boardroom. "This is a pathetic forged stunt. He is a retired mechanic from Brooklyn. He does not have $50 million. Throw him out of here right now before I call the police." Richard did not look up from the papers. He slowly sank back into his executive leather chair, his face gray and completely defeated. "It is real, Megan," he whispered, his voice entirely hollow. "The routing numbers, the corporate seals, the trustee signatures. It is all perfectly verified. He owns everything." I stepped closer to the table, resting my hands calmly on the edge. "As the primary managing director of Vanguard Trust, I am officially executing the immediate recall of all outstanding toxic debt," I announced, my voice dropping to a lethal absolute calm. "You have exactly 1 hour to produce $50 million in liquid capital, Richard. Since we both know your accounts are entirely overdrawn, I am initiating a total hostile liquidation of Albright Luxury Developments." Megan stared at her father in absolute disbelief. The reality of her sudden catastrophic poverty was crashing down on her like a physical weight. "You cannot do this," she hissed, turning her venomous glare toward me. "You are nothing but a filthy grease monkey. You do not belong in this building." I looked at her with pure, freezing contempt. "I spent 40 years covered in motor oil and industrial grease," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. "But every single dollar I earned was completely honest. While your father was busy inflating a fake real estate empire with toxic loans and stolen properties, I was quietly buying up the very ground you walk on. You thought you could kick me out of my home and erase my wife's memory with a sledgehammer. You thought destroying Evelyn's brick wall would break my spirit. You were entirely wrong." I pointed a steady finger directly at her chest. "I own the boutique you were locked out of yesterday morning, Megan. I own the bulldozer you used to destroy my garden. I own the building we are currently standing in. I even own the leather chair you are sitting on. You are not a wealthy socialite anymore. You are a trespasser sitting on my property." Megan stumbled backward, her knees hitting the edge of the boardroom table. The arrogant high society mask was completely shattered, leaving only a terrified, helpless woman who suddenly realized she had absolutely nothing left. The executive board members began packing their briefcases, frantically desperate to escape the blast radius of the collapsing company. A pathetic whimpering sound broke the heavy silence in the room. Kendrick was still on the floor. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, dragging his $3,000 custom suit across the commercial carpet. He reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the hem of my tailored trousers. "Dad, please." He sobbed, his face wet with terrified tears and cold sweat. "Please, you have to stop this. The Volkov Syndicate is going to kill me. They smashed Megan's car last night. They told me I have until the end of the day to deliver $2 million in clean cash, or they are going to put a bullet in my head. You have the money, Dad. You can save me." I looked down at the boy I had sacrificed my own body to raise. There was absolutely no love left in my heart for him. I reached into my inner coat pocket and pulled out the small digital voice recorder. I tossed it casually onto the center of the mahogany table. It clattered loudly against the polished wood. I also threw down a thick stack of bank statements detailing his massive embezzlement scheme. "Save you?" I asked, my tone completely devoid of any parental warmth. "You mean the way you tried to save me?" I pressed the playback button on the digital recorder. Kendrick's own voice filled the boardroom, echoing with devastating clarity. "I am already fixing it," the recorded voice stammered. "I have been secretly skimming capital from the senior client retirement portfolios. I illegally diverted $500,000 yesterday. I am transferring another $1.5 million tomorrow morning." The remaining executives in the room gasped in sheer horror. Richard Albright stared at his son-in-law with pure, unadulterated disgust. Kendrick buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "You did not just betray your own father," I said, looking down at his pathetic, trembling form. "You actively stole the life savings of innocent elderly people to feed your degenerate gambling addiction. You plotted to lock me in a chemical nightmare just to cover your tracks. You are not my son, Kendrick. You are a relentless parasite. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open for the second time that afternoon. The heavy rhythmic sound of tactical boots marching across the marble floor echoed down the corridor. 4 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across their backs marched purposefully into the room. They were flanked by 2 armed United States Marshals. The lead agent stepped forward holding a thick stack of federal arrest warrants. Kendrick Hayes, the agent, announced, his voice booming with absolute legal authority. You are under arrest for massive corporate embezzlement, severe wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy to commit extortion. Stand up and place your hands behind your back immediately. Kendrick did not move. He stayed curled on the floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of his impending reality. 2 federal agents stepped forward, grabbed him roughly by his expensive suit jacket, and hauled him to his feet. The cold, sharp click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the silent boardroom was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Megan watched her husband being dragged away like a common criminal. She did not shed a single tear for him. She simply stared at the empty space where her entire fabricated life used to be. The slaughter was nearly complete, but I still had one final lesson to teach her. I adjusted my silk tie, turned my back on the ruined Albright family, and walked calmly out of the boardroom, leaving them to drown in the absolute wreckage of their own unparalleled greed. The news of Kendrick being dragged out of the Albright boardroom in federal handcuffs hit Wall Street like a seismic shockwave. By the time the stock market opened the next morning, the financial media had already uncovered the massive Vanguard Trust hostile takeover. Richard Albright watched his $50 million empire evaporate in real time. His stock prices plummeted to mere pennies. I sat in my private suite at Obsidian Wealth Management, sipping black coffee and watching the financial news networks report the total collapse of Albright Luxury Developments. Richard tried to file for emergency bankruptcy protection, but Jonathan Reed had already filed the necessary legal injunctions blocking any safe harbor for their corporate assets. We seized their commercial properties, their luxury apartment complexes, and their active development sites. Richard was officially evicted from the very boardroom where he had tried to steal my house. He was stripped of his corporate vehicles, his company credit cards, and his unearned prestige. My encrypted phone rang later that afternoon. It was Richard Albright calling from a borrowed line. He begged me for a private meeting, pleading for a fraction of his company back. He offered to publicly apologize and promised to make Megan drop all claims to my house. I listened to his desperate bargaining for exactly 1 minute. I told him that my late wife Evelyn built her legacy with bruised knees and calloused hands, while he built his by stealing from the vulnerable. I hung up the phone and instructed Jonathan to liquidate Richard's personal estate to cover the remaining debt margins. The Albright name, which had once opened every elite door in Manhattan, was now completely toxic. 2 days later, we stood in a Brooklyn civil courtroom to formally reverse the fraudulent property transfer. The atmosphere was completely different from the lavish high society parties Megan was used to. She arrived at the courthouse wearing the same wrinkled designer jacket she had worn on the day of the raid. Her hair was unkempt, and she carried a cheap plastic folder instead of her usual designer handbag. Since her father's assets were entirely frozen, she could not afford to hire a competent defense attorney. She was forced to represent herself. I sat calmly at the plaintiff's table with Jonathan Reed. The judge, a stern-looking man with zero tolerance for family fraud, reviewed the mountain of evidence we provided. We submitted the recorded extortion from Dr. Thorne, the forged medical proxy, and the clear proof of my flawless mental health. Megan tried to argue her case, but her voice was shaky and desperate. She claimed she was just trying to help a sick old man manage a dangerous property. She shamelessly blamed the entire fraudulent scheme on Kendrick, claiming she was a victim of his manipulation. Jonathan stood up and systematically dismantled her lies. He presented the banking records showing Megan paying Dr. Thorne $50,000 from her personal account. He played the audio of her screaming at Kendrick to finalize the fake contracts. The judge cut her off immediately, his face flushed with anger. He declared the medical proxy and the property transfer completely void. He officially restored the deed of the Brooklyn house back into my name and ordered Megan to vacate the premises within 24 hours. Furthermore, he forwarded her forged documents directly to the district attorney for severe criminal prosecution. Megan stared at the judge in utter disbelief, realizing that her wealthy tears held absolutely no power in a courtroom governed by hard evidence. Later that afternoon, I attended the federal arraignment for Kendrick at the district courthouse. He was led into the courtroom wearing a standard orange prison jumpsuit, his hands and ankles bound by heavy steel chains. He looked incredibly small and fragile, completely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his fake corporate swagger. He scanned the gallery with desperate, exhausted eyes. He was looking for Megan. He was looking for his wealthy father-in-law to post his bail, but the Albright family had completely abandoned him. Megan had already drafted divorce papers in a pathetic attempt to distance herself from his federal crimes. Kendrick finally locked eyes with me, sitting in the back row. I did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. I did not nod or smile. I simply stared at him with the cold, detached gaze of a stranger. The federal prosecutor detailed his massive embezzlement scheme, explaining how he had stolen millions from the retirement funds of innocent elderly clients to pay off a violent organized crime syndicate. The prosecutor explicitly mentioned the danger posed by the Volkov family, stating that Kendrick had essentially signed his own death warrant if released onto the streets. Given his massive debts to the Russian mob and the severe flight risk he posed, the judge categorically denied bail. Kendrick was remanded to federal custody pending a full trial. As the armed marshals dragged him out of the courtroom, he began to sob uncontrollably. He called out for me, begging for his father to save him. I remained perfectly still. He had traded an honest father who loved him for a toxic lifestyle that ultimately threw him in a concrete cage. I walked out of the courthouse feeling a profound sense of closure. The boy I raised was gone, and the criminal he became was exactly where he belonged. By the end of the week, the complete financial liquidation reached Megan's personal life. Since Kendrick was in federal prison and her father was facing total bankruptcy, the luxury Manhattan penthouse she lived in was seized by the bank. I drove my rusted Ford truck into the city and parked across the street from her high-rise building. I watched from a secure distance as court-appointed bailiffs carried her expensive furniture and designer clothing out to the curb. It was a beautiful, poetic reflection of the exact same treatment she had given my late wife's belongings just a few weeks prior. She stood on the sidewalk watching her glamorous life being tossed into cheap cardboard boxes. The sky grew dark, and a freezing rain began to fall, soaking her unsealed boxes and ruining her expensive shoes. She frantically dialed numbers on her cell phone, trying to find a friend to take her in. But her elite circle had completely vanished. Her socialite status was permanently revoked. She had absolutely no money, no property, and no family willing to house her. The arrogant woman who had smashed my champagne glass and ordered a demolition crew to destroy my garden was now functionally homeless. She sat on the wet pavement surrounded by the ruined fragments of her fake empire. She had finally hit absolute rock bottom. But I knew she was not finished yet. Desperate people always make one final pathetic attempt to save themselves, and I was fully prepared for her inevitable approach. I sat in the warm cabin of my truck listening to the heavy rain drumming against the metal roof. Megan was shivering on the sidewalk, clutching a thin designer jacket tightly around her shoulders. Her expensive mascara was running down her pale cheeks, mixing with the dirty city rain. She looked frantically up and down the street, hoping for a miracle that was never going to come. Her luxury lifestyle had evaporated overnight, leaving her completely stranded in a world she used to actively despise. Then her eyes locked onto my rusted Ford truck parked directly across the avenue. She recognized the vehicle instantly. I saw the exact moment her sheer desperation overrode her massive ego. She abandoned her soaking wet cardboard boxes and started walking toward me. Her designer heels splashed violently through the deep, muddy puddles, but she did not care anymore. She crossed the busy street, dodging aggressive New York taxi cabs until she reached the driver's side of my truck. She slapped her wet palms against the glass, leaving greasy smudges on the window. "Xavier," she yelled, her voice barely audible over the roaring storm. "Please open the window. I need to talk to you." I let her stand out there in the freezing rain for a full minute. I wanted her to feel the exact same biting cold I felt when her private security guard shoved me onto the concrete porch of my own home. I wanted her to truly understand the absolute helplessness of being entirely locked out and stripped of all dignity. Finally, I pressed the button, and the window slowly rolled down. Megan grabbed the edge of the wet glass, her knuckles turning white from the freezing temperature. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She was shivering so violently her teeth were visibly chattering. "Xavier, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You have to help me. I have absolutely nothing left in the world. The bank took my apartment and they padlocked my boutique. My father will not even answer my phone calls because his corporate lawyers told him to sever all contact with me to save himself. I am completely destitute. She leaned closer to the open window, trying to project an aura of innocent victimhood. You have to believe me, Xavier. I was totally manipulated by Kendrick. He was the one drowning in massive gambling debts to the Russian mob. He forced me to go along with the fraudulent medical proxy because he was terrified for his physical life. I never wanted to take your house away from you. I always respected you. I am just an innocent victim of his toxic addiction and his lies. She forced a wet, pathetic sob, hoping to trigger some deep paternal instinct inside my heart. I just need a small loan, she pleaded, wiping her ruined makeup with a trembling hand. Just $50,000 to get a quiet apartment and start over. That is absolutely nothing to you now. You have hundreds of millions of dollars. You are a good Christian man, Xavier. You raised a family from nothing. You know what it means to show mercy and forgiveness to someone who is suffering. Please do not leave me out here on the street to die like a stray animal. I looked at the woman who had happily ordered a construction crew to smash my late wife's beautiful garden wall. She was completely, utterly incapable of taking genuine responsibility for her own malicious actions. I stared down at her, perfectly calm. The cold rain blew into the cabin of the truck, but I did not even flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of blinding anger. My absolute indifference was far more devastating than any physical blow could ever be. You are not a victim, Megan, I stated, my voice cutting through the storm like a sharpened steel blade. You are exactly where you put yourself through your own unparalleled greed. You did not forge my medical records because you were scared of Kendrick. You did it because you are incredibly selfish, and you honestly believed I was just a stupid old black man who could be easily erased and forgotten. You stood in my living room drinking expensive champagne and bragging to your elite friends about throwing me into a locked psychiatric ward. You smiled when your private security guard pushed me down onto the wet concrete. You specifically ordered a man with a heavy sledgehammer to destroy the red brick wall Evelyn built with her bare hands. You did all of that with a massive, arrogant smile on your face. Megan opened her mouth to argue, but I raised my hand, silencing her instantly. You asked for my mercy, I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal quiet register. The mercy I am showing you right now is the simple fact that I am letting you stand on this sidewalk instead of throwing you into a federal prison cell right next to my son. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up a clear plastic folder. It contained the original forged medical proxy she had used to steal my home just a few short weeks ago. I pulled the crisp document out and held it up to the open window. This piece of paper was supposed to be my absolute death sentence, I said, looking her dead in the eyes. You thought this single document made you a powerful, untouchable real estate mogul. Let us see exactly how much shelter it provides you tonight. I dropped the paper out of the window. It fluttered down heavily, landing directly in the deep, muddy puddle, soaking her ruined designer shoes. Megan looked down at the ruined document floating in the filthy street water. The absolute finality of the moment crushed the last remaining fraction of her arrogant spirit. She fell to her knees right there in the muddy gutter, sobbing uncontrollably as the freezing rain continued to punish her fragile frame. She reached out, trying to grab the wet tire of my truck, begging me loudly not to leave her behind in the cold. I did not say another word to her. I pressed the button and the glass window rolled up tight, entirely shutting out the pathetic sound of her miserable wailing. I put the truck into drive and pulled away from the curb without hesitation. I checked the rearview mirror one last time. Megan was just a small, pathetic shadow kneeling in the rain, surrounded by her soggy cardboard boxes and the shattered illusion of her unearned wealth. I turned the corner and drove away, leaving her permanently in the past where she belonged. The massive storm was finally breaking as I crossed the bridge back into Brooklyn. The heavy, dark clouds were actively parting, allowing bright, warm streaks of sunlight to illuminate the wet city streets. I was heading back to the home Evelyn and I built from the ground up, ready to clean up the toxic mess my son had made and restore our family legacy to its absolute rightful glory. I parked the rusted Ford truck in the driveway of my Brooklyn home. The heavy storm had completely passed, leaving the neighborhood washed clean. The bright afternoon sun reflected off the puddles on the street. I stepped out of the vehicle and took a deep breath of the crisp air. The massive commercial dumpster Megan had parked on my front lawn was already gone. Jonathan had arranged for a private removal service to haul away the debris before I even arrived. The house stood tall and proud, its historic bones completely unbothered by the superficial damage inflicted by arrogant intruders. I walked up the concrete steps, looking at the spots where my wooden porch planks had been ripped away. The physical damage was there, but but the spirit of the house remained entirely intact. I unlocked the heavy oak door with my original silver key. The cheap replacement locks Megan had installed were removed by a locksmith earlier that morning. I stepped into the foyer and closed the door behind me. The absolute silence was beautiful. There was no thumping electronic jazz music. There were no arrogant socialites drinking expensive champagne on my hardwood floors. There was only the familiar, comforting scent of old wood and the faint, lingering memory of Evelyn's lavender perfume. I walked through the living room, inspecting the scuff marks left by designer heels. They were superficial wounds. The foundation I had built 30 years ago was solid rock. I remembered the exact day Evelyn and I bought this property. We had absolutely nothing but our savings and a shared vision of a secure future for our unborn son. We spent our first night here sleeping on a cheap air mattress in the middle of the empty living room, eating cold takeout food and dreaming of the life we would build. We did not need external validation or inherited wealth to feel powerful. We had each other, and we had our relentless work ethic. Kendrick forgot that lesson the moment he stepped into his first corporate banking seminar. He chose the illusion of prestige over the reality of character. The interior of the house was secure, but my most important task was waiting outside. I walked through the kitchen and stepped out the back door into the side garden. The ground was heavily trampled by heavy construction boots, and the vibrant flower beds were crushed. In the center of the garden lay the tragic pile of dusty red rubble. Evelyn's beautiful brick wall had been violently reduced to shattered fragments. I stood over the ruins, feeling a profound sense of duty. I did not call a landscaping company or hire a team of professional masons to fix the damage. This was not a job for strangers. This was a deeply personal restoration. I walked to my garage and pulled out my old heavy canvas tool bag. I found a trowel, a mixing bucket, and a heavy bag of professional-grade cement mortar. I carried the supplies to the garden and knelt down directly in the damp soil. I did not care about ruining my expensive tailored trousers or getting my pristine cuffs dirty. I poured the dry gray powder into the bucket, added water from the garden hose, and mixed the heavy sludge with my bare hands. The rough, gritty texture of the wet cement felt incredibly grounding. It was the honest, tactile sensation of real physical labor. I picked up the first intact red brick from the rubble. I scraped off the old broken mortar, applying a fresh, thick layer of the wet cement. I placed the brick carefully onto the foundation, pressing it down firmly until it was perfectly level. I repeated the process brick by brick, layer by layer, slowly resurrecting the physical manifestation of my wife's profound love for our home. My muscles burned and my knees ached from kneeling in the wet dirt. My hands were completely covered in thick gray cement and red brick dust. This was the exact grime Kendrick had looked at with absolute disgust when he was a teenager. He thought this dirt represented poverty and failure. He never understood that this dirt was the ultimate symbol of independence. It was the physical proof that I owned my environment and shaped my own reality. It took me 4 grueling hours to rebuild the entire wall. When I finally set the last top brick into place, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the restored garden. I stood up, wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my forearm. The wall was not perfectly uniform. It had the rough, uneven character of something built by human hands, driven by sheer willpower. It was completely beautiful. I walked back inside and washed the heavy cement from my hands using the abrasive lemon soap Evelyn always kept by the kitchen sink. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee, filling the house with the rich, familiar aroma of my daily routine. I poured the steaming liquid into a simple ceramic mug and walked out to the front porch. I sat down in Evelyn's old wooden rocking chair, listening to the quiet sounds of the Brooklyn evening. The neighborhood was peaceful. A black Federal Corrections transport van was miles away, moving Kendrick toward his first night in a concrete cell. Megan was wandering the cold Manhattan streets, desperately searching for a warm place to sleep. Richard Albright was sitting in a dark office watching his stolen $50 million empire get carved up by my anonymous board members. They had all chased the illusion of power, and it led them straight to absolute ruin. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a standard white envelope. It had arrived in the morning mail, forwarded from the Federal Detention Center. The return address bore Kendrick's inmate identification number. He was already writing letters begging for my financial intervention, pleading for high-priced defense attorneys and a second chance. I did not even break the seal. I held the envelope, looking at my son's handwriting for a long, silent moment. Then I calmly tore the letter cleanly in half. I tore it again and dropped the shredded pieces into the small metal trash can beside my chair. There would be no second chances. There would be no forgiveness bought with stolen money. The game was entirely over and the board was permanently closed. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter warmth settle in my chest. I looked out over the front lawn, feeling the immense quiet power of true ownership. People often say that money cannot buy you a loving family or cure a broken heart. They are absolutely right. The hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in my shadow accounts did not stop my son from becoming a ruthless monster. It did not bring Evelyn back to me. But as I sat on my porch looking at the neighborhood I had conquered through decades of invisible labor, I realized the true value of absolute wealth. Money does not buy you a family. But when the people you love decide to turn into predators, money is the sharpest, most devastating sword you can wield to protect your dignity. I was Xavier Hayes, a retired black mechanic from Brooklyn, and I had just engineered the flawless destruction of a modern corporate empire without ever raising my voice. I returned to Manhattan one final time the following Monday. Obsidian Wealth Management had fully processed the hostile liquidation of Albright Luxury Developments. Jonathan Reed stood at the head of the boardroom table. It was the same table where Richard Albright had lost his empire. Today the room was filled with my hand-picked board members from Vanguard Trust. They looked at me with absolute reverence. I took my seat at the head of the table. I instructed Jonathan to dissolve the Albright corporate name permanently, erase it from every building and every legal registry I commanded. I want the luxury development projects in Brooklyn halted immediately. We are redesigning those properties. They will no longer be high-priced glass boxes for arrogant socialites. We are converting them into affordable housing for the generational families who actually built that borough. The board members nodded in unison. Richard Albright spent his entire career pushing vulnerable people out of their homes. I was going to use his stolen wealth to put them right back in. I received a comprehensive update regarding Richard and Megan later that afternoon. Richard Albright was no longer just a bankrupt former executive. Federal regulators had scrutinized his books following our hostile takeover. They discovered dozens of instances of systemic mortgage fraud and tax evasion. He was formally indicted and facing up to 15 years in federal prison. His passports were seized and he was restricted to a cheap rental apartment in Queens awaiting trial. Megan fared no better. Stripped of her inheritance and her boutique, she was entirely unemployable in the corporate sector due to her pending criminal charges for the forged medical proxy. Jonathan informed me that she had recently secured a job working the overnight shift at a commercial laundromat on the outskirts of the city. She spent her nights washing hotel bed sheets for minimum wage, standing on her feet for 10 hours a day. She was finally experiencing the brutal physical labor she had so casually mocked when she looked at my grease-stained hands. Justice had balanced the scales with absolute flawless precision. 2 weeks later, I received a formal visitation request from the Federal Detention Center. Kendrick had placed my name on his approved visitor list. I decided to grant him exactly 15 minutes of my time. I did not go to offer comfort. I went to deliver absolute finality. I drove to the heavily fortified prison in upstate New York. I walked through the metal detectors and sterile concrete hallways wearing my bespoke charcoal suit. The guards escorted me into a small visitation room featuring a thick partition of bulletproof glass. Kendrick was brought in through the opposite door. He wore a faded orange jumpsuit. His face was covered in dark purple bruises and a fresh bandage was taped roughly over his left eyebrow. The Volkov syndicate had clearly reached him even behind federal bars. He picked up the heavy black telephone receiver. His hands trembled violently. I picked up my receiver and stared at him with zero emotion. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Thank you for coming. I am terrified. They have people inside here. The Russians are demanding their money with interest. If I do not pay them, they are going to kill me before my trial even starts." He pressed his bruised face against the glass. "You took $50 million from Megan's father. You have more money than God. Please just pay off the $2 million. Consider it an early inheritance. Just buy my life back." I listened to his pathetic bargaining. Even with a bruised face and a federal indictment hanging over his head, he was still demanding my money. He still viewed me as a financial resource instead of a human being. I held the plastic receiver close to my mouth. "You do not have an inheritance, Kendrick. I stated, my voice perfectly flat and cold. You traded your inheritance the moment you tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward. You traded your family the moment you threw your mother's belongings out into the freezing rain. You made a conscious decision to play a high-stakes game with violent criminals. Now you must pay the absolute price for your own arrogance. He began to sob heavily, banging his chained fists against the thick glass partition. You are my father, he screamed, his voice distorted by the cheap phone speaker. You are supposed to protect me. I stared at him without blinking. I protected you for 35 years, I replied. I broke my back working under cars to give you a perfect shield against the world. You took that shield and you melted it down to buy expensive suits and fake prestige. You chose to be a predator, Kendrick. Unfortunately for you, you chose to hunt in a jungle filled with much bigger monsters. I am not your father anymore. I am the man who survived your betrayal. I placed the receiver back onto the hook, cutting off his desperate screams. I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and walked out of the visitation room without looking back a single time. I drove back to my home in Brooklyn. The afternoon sun was shining brightly over the restored brick wall in the side garden. The neighborhood was vibrant and alive. I walked up my concrete steps and unlocked the heavy oak door. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt completely secure. I had instructed Jonathan Reed to establish the Evelyn Hayes Foundation using a significant portion of the liquidated Albright assets. The foundation was designed specifically to provide aggressive free legal representation for elderly individuals facing financial abuse from predatory family members. I was making absolutely sure that no other senior citizen in my city would ever be forced out of their home by a greedy relative. Megan thought she could erase my legacy with a forged signature. Instead, she handed me the ultimate power to solidify it forever. I walked into the kitchen and washed my hands with the abrasive lemon soap. I dried them on a simple cotton towel. My knuckles still bore the faint scars of 40 years of manual labor. I looked at those hands and felt a profound sense of pride. They had built engines, they had built a home, and they had flawlessly dismantled a corrupt empire. I brewed a fresh pot of dark coffee and poured it into my favorite ceramic mug. I walked out to the front porch and sat down in the wooden rocking chair. The street was peaceful. The air was crisp. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, watching the world move forward. I had successfully defended my territory. I had honored my late wife. I had proven that true power does not roar. True power waits silently in the shadows, perfectly calculating the exact moment to strike. The destruction of the Albright family and my son Kendrick was nearly complete, but the legal system still demanded its final tribute. 6 months passed since the absolute collapse of their empire. The autumn wind swept through the streets of Brooklyn, carrying the crisp promise of a new season. I had spent those months quietly solidifying my hold on the reclaimed properties and launching the Evelyn Hayes Foundation. But the wheels of justice grind slowly, and there were still final chapters to be written in the courtroom. The federal sentencing hearing for my son Kendrick was scheduled for a bleak Tuesday morning in November. I dressed in my tailored charcoal suit, adjusting my tie in the mirror with perfect composure. I was not going to this courthouse to support a family member. I was attending as a primary witness to the absolute consequences of extreme greed. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was a massive structure of cold granite and unyielding authority. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors of the courtroom and took a seat in the second row. Jonathan Reed sat beside me, his presence a silent reminder of the lethal legal machinery we had deployed. Kendrick was led into the room by 2 armed United States Marshals. The dark purple bruises he wore during my prison visit had faded, but the arrogant light in his eyes was permanently extinguished. He looked incredibly frail, shuffling toward the defense table in his loose orange jumpsuit and heavy steel chains. He did not dare to turn his head to look at me. He kept his eyes glued to the polished wooden floor, completely crushed by the weight of his impending reality. The federal prosecutor stood up and addressed the judge with absolute precision. He did not mince his words. He detailed exactly how Kendrick had utilized his prestigious position as an investment banker to systematically drain the retirement accounts of vulnerable senior citizens. He presented the digital wire transfers, the offshore shell companies, and the final payments directed to the violent Volkov organized crime syndicate. To make the devastation tangible, the prosecutor invited 3 of Kendrick's victims to read their impact statements. They were elderly men and women who had worked their entire lives only to have their financial security erased by a man buying custom suits and luxury sports cars. Listening to their trembling voices, my heart hardened even further against the boy I had raised. He had become the exact type of corporate predator I had spent my life protecting my family from. Kendrick's court-appointed defense attorney stood up to plead for leniency. The expensive private lawyers had all abandoned him the moment his bank accounts were frozen. The defense attorney desperately tried to paint Kendrick as a tragic victim of a severe gambling addiction. He argued that the physical threats from the Russian mob had driven him to commit financial crimes out of sheer terror for his own life. He begged the judge to consider a reduced sentence, claiming Kendrick was a first-time offender who simply made a catastrophic error in judgment under extreme duress. The federal judge looked down from the high bench, his expression completely devoid of mercy. He adjusted his glasses and addressed Kendrick directly. "You were not a victim." "Mr. Hayes," the judge stated, his voice booming through the silent courtroom, "you were a highly educated executive earning a massive legitimate salary. You chose to sit in illegal high-stakes gambling dens. You chose to borrow millions from violent criminals. And when the consequences of your own arrogant actions caught up to you, you chose to steal the life savings of innocent working-class people. You even attempted to illegally strip your own father of his mental autonomy and his home to cover your tracks. Your actions demonstrate a complete and total lack of moral character." The judge banged his heavy wooden gavel. "I sentence you to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay full financial restitution to every single victim you defrauded." Kendrick collapsed into his chair, letting out a single hollow gasp. 25 years. He would be an old man by the time he ever saw the outside of a concrete wall again. The marshals grabbed his arms and hauled him to his feet, dragging him toward the holding cell doors. Just before he disappeared into the dark corridor, he finally turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were wide with absolute terror, silently begging for a fatherly intervention that was never going to come. I did not blink. I did not shift my posture. I watched the heavy steel door slam shut behind him, erasing him from society. The mechanism of justice did not stop with Kendrick. 3 weeks later, I found myself in a state courtroom witnessing the final destruction of Megan Albright. She had lost her penthouse, her luxury boutique, and her elite social standing, but the law was not finished with her. The district attorney had officially charged her with elder abuse, criminal conspiracy, and multiple counts of forgery relating to the fraudulent medical proxy she used to steal my home. Because her father was entirely bankrupt and facing his own severe federal indictment, Megan had to rely on a severely overworked public defender. She sat at the defense table wearing a cheap faded blouse. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot and her hands trembled uncontrollably. She tried the exact same manipulative tactics she had used on me during the rainstorm. She cried loudly on the witness stand, claiming she was completely terrified of her husband and the Russian mob. She swore she only forged the medical documents because she was trying to save her family from violent retaliation. She tried to play the innocent wealthy housewife who was dragged into a criminal underworld against her will. But the prosecutor was utterly relentless. He played the audio recordings Jonathan and I had secured. Megan's own voice echoed through the courtroom, shrill and demanding. He played the tape of her screaming at Kendrick to finalize the fake contracts. He played the recording of her mocking me as a senile old fool in front of her high society guests. He showed the jury the bank statements proving she paid Dr. Thorne a massive bribe from her personal trust fund. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned a unanimous verdict of guilty on all charges. The state judge looked at Megan with profound disgust. "You weaponized the medical system to prey on a senior citizen for your own financial gain," the judge declared. "You destroyed property, forged legal documents, and attempted to ruin an innocent man's life purely out of greed." The judge sentenced her to 7 years in a state correctional facility. Megan screamed in absolute panic as the female bailiffs approached her with handcuffs. She looked frantically around the courtroom, searching for anyone to save her. Her elite friends were gone. Her father was gone. Her husband was gone. She was dragged out of the courtroom, kicking and crying, stripped of the unearned privilege that had defined her entire existence. Richard Albright finalized the collapse of his bloodline a month later. Facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence regarding his systemic corporate fraud, he accepted a binding plea deal to avoid spending the rest of his life behind bars. He surrendered every remaining asset he possessed and accepted a 12-year federal prison sentence. The mighty Albright Luxury Developments empire was completely dissolved, its vast portfolio fully absorbed and repurposed by Vanguard Trust. I stepped out of the courthouse on a freezing December afternoon. The sky was clear and bright. I walked to my rusted Ford truck and drove back across the bridge to Brooklyn. I had spent 40 years quietly building a fortress, and when the predators came to knock it down, I used their own greed to crush them into dust. I parked in my driveway and looked at my home. The red brick wall in the garden stood strong and perfect. The front porch was fully restored. The next morning, I hosted the official grand opening of the Evelyn Hayes Foundation. We purchased a massive commercial building right in the heart of Brooklyn using the liquidated funds from the Albright Empire. The facility was staffed with aggressive corporate lawyers, dedicated social workers, and financial experts. Their sole mission was to protect elderly citizens from predatory relatives and corrupt real estate developers. I stood on the main stage looking at my hands, the calluses and the faint at my hands. The calluses and the faint scars from decades of mechanical labor were still there. They were the proud marks of a man who earned every single breath he took. I had successfully turned a massive personal tragedy into an impenetrable shield for my entire community. The war was officially over, and the good guys had won absolutely everything. The federal agents did not hesitate for a single second. They grabbed Kendrick by the arms of his $3,000 custom suit and hauled him roughly to his feet. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the silent boardroom like a thunderclap. It was the sound of absolute finality. Kendrick did not resist or try to fight back. His legs buckled completely beneath him, and the two federal agents had to practically drag his dead weight across the thick corporate carpet. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes wide, with a pathetic silent plea for salvation. He wanted his father to step in and pay away his sins. I did not blink. I offered him absolutely nothing. I watched the son I had sacrificed my body to raise get dragged away like a common thief. As the heavy double doors closed behind him, Megan finally snapped. The sheer shock of the moment gave way to a violent, hysterical panic. She let out a piercing, gut-wrenching scream that shattered the remaining professional atmosphere of the room. She lunged forward, her manicured hands clawing at the empty space where her husband had just been standing. She screamed at the remaining executives, demanding they do something, ordering her father to call his high-priced lawyers. But Richard Albright was completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the tabletop. Megan threw her designer purse against the glass wall, completely losing her grip on reality. Her flawless high society mask was entirely gone, leaving only a terrified woman throwing a desperate childish tantrum in a room full of people who could no longer help her. While Megan continued her hysterical screaming, Jonathan Reed calmly opened a secondary compartment in his thick black leather briefcase. He pulled out a crisp legal document bearing the official raised seal of the state Supreme Court. He dropped it onto the mahogany table right on top of the fraudulent medical proxy Megan had used to steal my home. Megan stopped screaming and stared at the paper, her chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths. "I suggest you read that very carefully, Megan," Jonathan stated, his voice carrying the lethal precision of a seasoned corporate executioner. "That is an emergency judicial injunction signed by a state judge less than an hour ago. We presented the undeniable audio evidence of your extortion conspiracy alongside my client's flawless psychological evaluation. The court has officially and permanently annulled the property transfer mandate you forged." Jonathan tapped the paper firmly with his index finger. "The deed to the Brooklyn property has been legally restored to Mr. Xavier Hayes effective immediately. Any further attempt to access, occupy, or alter that property will result in your immediate arrest for criminal trespassing and grand larceny." Megan stared at the legal injunction, her eyes darting frantically across the bold black text. The massive real estate deal she had promised her father, the single asset that was supposed to save their sinking empire, was completely dead. She reached out with a trembling hand, hovering over the document, as if touching it would make her failure real. She had treated my home like a disposable pawn in her greedy financial chess game. She thought she could erase my legacy with a few fake signatures and a bribed doctor. Now she was staring at the absolute legal proof that her entire conspiracy had failed spectacularly. The Brooklyn house was legally mine again, and she was completely powerless to take it. The reality of her failed real estate scheme was just the beginning of her absolute nightmare. I looked at Richard Albright, who was still slumped in his executive chair, completely broken by the Vanguard Trust takeover. "Richard," I said, my voice demanding his full attention, "explain the new financial reality to your daughter." Richard slowly raised his heavy head, looking at Megan with hollow, defeated eyes. "We are finished, Megan," he whispered, his voice cracking under the immense weight of his failure. "The company is entirely liquidated. The corporate accounts are frozen. The banks are seizing the penthouses and the commercial retail spaces to cover the margins. There is absolutely no money left anywhere." Megan stumbled backward, her expensive high heels catching on the edge of the carpet. "What do you mean there is no money left?" she gasped, clutching her chest. "My trust fund, my boutique. You promised me those were completely secure. They belong to Vanguard Trust now," Richard replied, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "He owns every single asset we possessed. Your inheritance is completely gone." Megan looked at me, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure terror. She had never worked a hard day in her entire life. Her entire identity was built on unearned wealth and arrogant privilege. Now she was facing a world where she had absolutely nothing. But her financial destruction was not complete. Jonathan Reed adjusted his glasses and delivered the final devastating blow. Furthermore, Mrs. Albright, Jonathan continued, his tone completely devoid of any sympathy. "Since you are legally married to Kendrick Hayes and your name is tied to his primary joint accounts, you are now jointly liable for his massive financial obligations. The federal government will be seizing your personal assets to pay restitution for the retirement funds he embezzled. And more importantly, the $2 million debt your husband owes to the Volkov syndicate is now actively your problem." Megan let out a choked, horrified gasp. The violent Russian mob enforcers who had smashed her luxury car would not stop hunting just because her husband was in a federal holding cell. They wanted their money, and she was the only one left to pay it. She was entirely bankrupt, facing severe criminal charges and actively hunted by ruthless criminals. She had hit absolute rock bottom. I looked at the complete devastation in the boardroom one last time to ensure the lesson was permanently ingrained. Richard Albright was a broken old man staring blankly at his ruined legacy, realizing his entire life of corporate theft had amounted to absolutely nothing. Megan was curled on the floor, sobbing hysterically as the crushing weight of her massive debts and vanished inheritance suffocated her. They were a family built entirely on greed, deception, and unearned privilege. The moment real adversity struck, their toxic foundation crumbled into dust. They had turned on each other instantly, eager to sacrifice anyone to save their own skin. I felt absolutely no pity for them. They had actively tried to destroy my life, steal my home, and lock me in a chemical nightmare. They deserved every single ounce of the misery they were currently experiencing. I buttoned my tailored charcoal suit jacket and nodded to Jonathan Reed. "We are done here," I stated, my voice perfectly calm and completely resolute. I turned my back on the weeping daughter and the defeated father, refusing to give them another second of my time. I walked out of the massive double doors with my security detail flanking me. My footsteps echoed sharply against the polished marble floors of the corporate hallway. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. I left the Albright family drowning in the absolute wreckage of their own unparalleled arrogance. The war was decisively won, and my legacy was finally secure. I exited the towering glass doors of the Albright corporate headquarters and stepped out onto the unforgiving Manhattan pavement. The sky above the city had turned a bruised, aggressive shade of purple. Almost instantly, a torrential downpour erupted from the heavy clouds. The rain fell in thick, blinding sheets, immediately clearing the busy sidewalks as people scrambled desperately for cover. I walked calmly to my rusted Ford truck parked by my security team right at the curb. I climbed into the cabin, shutting the heavy metal door and sealing out the chaotic noise of the sudden storm. I started the engine, the familiar rumble vibrating through the steering wheel. I put the truck into gear, preparing to merge into the dense city traffic and leave the financial district behind forever. But just as my foot shifted from the brake to the accelerator, a desperate figure darted aggressively across the rain-slicked street. The person ignored the blaring horns of oncoming taxicabs and threw their body directly in front of my front bumper. I slammed my heavy work boot onto the brake pedal, stopping the truck just inches away from impact. Through the rhythmic sweeping of my windshield wipers, I recognized the drenched, pathetic silhouette standing in the blinding rain. It was Megan. She had chased me all the way down from the boardroom, completely abandoning her ruined father to intercept my departure. She did not stay in front of the grill. She stumbled frantically around the front of the truck and threw herself against my driver's side door. She slammed her bare hands against the reinforced glass, leaving frantic, wet handprints across the window. Her immaculate designer outfit was completely plastered to her skin, and her expensive hairstyle hung in matted, heavy strings across her face. She was weeping hysterically, her mouth moving rapidly as she shouted over the deafening roar of the heavy rain. "Xavier, please wait!" she screamed, her voice muffled but distinct through the thick glass. "Please do not drive away. I need to talk to you." I kept the engine running and stared at her, completely unbothered by her frantic display. She pressed her face closer to the window, adopting the ultimate facade of a helpless, terrified victim. "You have to understand that I was completely manipulated by Kendrick," she cried out, pointing her finger back toward the corporate building. "He lied to me about everything. I had no idea he was stealing from his banking clients or dealing with violent Russian criminals. He told me you wanted to give us the house. He forced me to draft those documents because he was terrified for his physical life. I was just a naive wife trying to protect my marriage." She clasped her hands together in a desperate, pleading gesture, the heavy rain washing away her expensive makeup. "You have stripped my family of our entire $50 million company. You took my boutique and my inheritance. You have won, Xavier. You proved your point perfectly. I am begging you for a tiny fraction of mercy. Just give me a small loan, $50,000 to get a cheap apartment and start my life over. You have hundreds of millions. That money is absolutely nothing to you, but it is my entire survival. Please show me some grace." I looked down at the woman standing in the freezing, torrential downpour. She was still trying to weaponize her tears and leverage my humanity against me. Even after her entire empire had been dismantled and her husband had been dragged away in federal handcuffs, she was utterly incapable of genuine accountability. She honestly believed that if she cried hard enough, the tired old black man she had mocked and humiliated would suddenly soften and hand her a financial lifeline. I did not feel a single drop of pity for her. I reached over to the electronic control panel on my door and pressed the button. The driver's side window slowly glided down, exposing the cabin to the violent roaring sounds of the storm and the freezing wind. Megan let out a breathless gasp of relief, instantly believing her pathetic performance had actually worked. She reached her shivering hands up toward the open window, waiting eagerly for me to hand her a check or a bank transfer authorization that would magically erase her self-inflicted poverty. I did not speak a single word to her. I did not offer her a lecture on morality or a final warning about her toxic greed. My absolute silence was the heaviest weapon I had left to deploy. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. I pulled out a crisp, perfectly preserved piece of thick legal paper. It was the original fraudulent tax update document from my 68th birthday party. It was the fake power of attorney she had aggressively shoved across my dining table, the exact catalyst that sparked this entire brutal war. I held the document out the window, pinching the top corner between my thumb and index finger. Megan stared at the paper, her eyes widening in sheer horror as she recognized the printed legal jargon and the blank signature line at the bottom. She realized in that exact moment that I was not giving her a lifeline. I opened my fingers, letting go of the paper completely. The heavy wind caught the document instantly, fluttering it downwards until it landed flat into a deep, filthy puddle of oily mud directly beneath her ruined designer shoes. Megan looked down at the forged document floating in the toxic city street water. The absolute realization of her complete and total defeat finally crushed whatever remained of her massive ego. The piece of paper that was supposed to secure her a multi-million-dollar real estate empire was now just worthless garbage soaking in the gutter. I pressed the control button, and the glass window rolled smoothly back up, sealing the cabin tight and completely cutting off the sound of the violent storm outside. I shifted my rusted Ford truck into drive. I did not give her a final triumphant glare or a parting remark. I simply pressed my heavy work boot down onto the accelerator and pulled away from the curb. The heavy tires of my truck splashed through the deep puddle, completely submerging the fraudulent document in dark, thick mud. I checked my rearview mirror one last time as I merged into the busy Manhattan traffic. Megan had collapsed, entirely falling to her knees right there in the flooded street. She threw her head back and screamed frantically into the pouring rain, completely ignored by the rushing pedestrians and the blaring taxicabs. She was finally a ghost in a city that only respects true power. I turned the corner and drove toward the bridge, leaving her and the entire Albright legacy permanently in my rearview mirror. The drive across the Brooklyn Bridge felt remarkably different this time. The torrential rain that had washed over Manhattan was gone, completely replaced by a crisp and clear evening sky. The tires of my old rusted Ford truck hummed a steady rhythm against the damp asphalt. I navigated the familiar streets of my neighborhood. This was the place where I had bled, where I had sweat, and where I had quietly built an impenetrable fortress disguised as a modest life. I pulled into my driveway and shifted the truck into park. I stepped out into the cool evening air. The front yard was completely silent. I looked up at the sturdy wooden porch. The cheap, damp cardboard boxes that had once held my late wife's precious belongings were completely gone. Jonathan had ensured that a specialized restoration team removed every single trace of Megan's brief and toxic occupation before I even returned. The pristine wooden planks of the porch were spotless once again. The violent memory of being shoved to the concrete by a private security guard felt like a distant, fading echo. The house stood exactly as it had for over 30 years. It was a monument to hard, honest labor and unwavering resilience. I walked up the concrete steps, my heavy work boots making a solid, reassuring sound. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my original silver key. I slid it into the brass deadbolt. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped back into my sanctuary. The air inside smelled of polished wood and absolute victory. I walked slowly through the quiet hallway of my home. The hardwood floors I had installed by hand decades ago gleamed under the soft glow of the foyer lights. There were no arrogant socialites spilling vintage champagne on my rugs. There were no greedy children plotting to erase my existence in the dead of night. There was only the profound, unshakable peace of a home that had successfully repelled a hostile invasion. I moved through the living room and stepped out the back door into the side garden. The evening light cast long, peaceful shadows across the dark soil. A team of master stonemasons had been working tirelessly for the past 3 days. I walked over to the low red brick wall that enclosed the flower beds. Megan had ordered a demolition crew to smash it into a pile of dusty rubble just to prove her dominance over my property. But now the wall was standing tall once again. The masons had carefully gathered every salvaged piece of original brick and supplemented them with perfectly matched vintage clay. They used the exact same mortar mix and the exact same architectural pattern that Evelyn had designed 20 years ago. I reached out and rested my large calloused hand against the cool, rough surface of the newly laid bricks. The mortar was still slightly damp, curing perfectly in the crisp autumn air. I traced the uneven edges with my thumb, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of my late wife's enduring legacy. Megan thought she could destroy Evelyn's memory with a few swings of a heavy steel sledgehammer. She fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what we had built. You can temporarily break the physical stones, but you can never obliterate the foundation of genuine sacrifice. Evelyn's wall was whole again, standing as a permanent testament to a black woman who poured her soul into this earth. I stood in the quiet garden for a long time, drawing immense strength from the restored bricks. The malicious infection that had tried to rot this house from the inside out was completely eradicated forever. I walked back inside and headed straight into the kitchen. I turned on the brass faucet and washed my hands with the abrasive lemon soap. The rough lather scrubbed away the lingering dust from the garden, leaving my skin feeling clean and renewed. I dried my hands on a simple cotton towel, taking a long moment to look at the deep, permanent lines etched into my palms. These hands had tightened heavy wrenches, rebuilt broken engines, and ultimately dismantled a $50 million corporate empire. I opened the wooden cabinet and retrieved my favorite dark roast coffee beans. I measured the grounds carefully, enjoying the methodical, rhythmic process of brewing a fresh pot. The rich, bitter aroma quickly filled the kitchen, pushing out the last remaining phantom scents of Megan's expensive artificial perfume. I poured the steaming black liquid into a thick ceramic mug, holding it tightly to feel the comforting heat radiating against my scarred knuckles. I walked back into the living room and approached the large bay window that overlooked the front porch and the quiet street beyond. I sat down in my heavy vintage leather armchair. The leather was cracked and worn, molded perfectly to the shape of my body over thousands of quiet evenings. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the hot black coffee, letting the robust flavor settle deep in my chest. I looked out through the immaculate glass window, watching the neighborhood settle into the night. A few street lights flickered on, casting a warm yellow glow over the wet asphalt. Families were sitting down to dinner behind closed doors, completely unaware of the massive financial war that had just been waged and won right under their noses. I had actively neutralized every single threat to my existence. Richard Albright was a ruined, disgraced criminal awaiting federal trial in a cheap apartment. Megan Albright was washing dirty linens on the night shift, stripped of her fake prestige and drowning in mob debt. And Kendrick, the son who had looked at my greasy hands with absolute disgust, was currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary trading his $3,000 suits for a standard orange jumpsuit. The house was entirely silent, but it was not a lonely silence. It was the heavy, deeply satisfying silence of complete and absolute security. I took another long sip of my coffee, feeling the profound weight of my final victory. People in this world will constantly tell you that money cannot buy happiness. They will preach that immense wealth cannot cure a broken heart or magically repair a shattered family. They are absolutely right. The hundreds of millions of dollars resting securely in my shadow accounts at Vanguard Trust did not save my son from his own catastrophic greed. It did not stop him from betraying the very blood in his veins, and it certainly did not bring Evelyn back to sit beside me in this quiet room. But as I sat in my leather chair watching the peaceful Brooklyn street, I realized the absolute, undeniable truth about ultimate wealth. Money does not buy you a loving family. It does not manufacture genuine affection or instill moral character in a weak coward. But when the people you trusted most decide to turn into ruthless predators, money is the sharpest, most devastating sword you can ever wield. It is the ultimate equalizer against arrogance and unearned privilege. It gave me the silent, lethal power to protect my legacy, defend my home, and utterly crush those who dared to treat my dignity as a disposable asset. I am Xavier Hayes, a retired black mechanic from Brooklyn. I built my life with bruised knees and honest labor, and I proved to the world that true power never has to shout. It simply waits for the perfect moment to strike. There is a profound danger in erasing your roots to chase the illusion of high society status. Kendrick looked at my grease-stained hands and saw only poverty, completely blind to the fact that those hands built the very foundation he stood on. When you abandon the people who sacrificed everything for your success to impress a world that only values your wallet, you build your entire life on quicksand. Character is the only currency that survives a storm. My son traded his honor for empty prestige, and it left him with absolutely nothing, while the legacy he despised outlasted his entire fabricated empire. Never forget where you came from or who bled to help you get there. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who values genuine character over superficial wealth, and subscribe for more stories of absolute justice.